My father and stepmother showed up at my front door uninvited on a Sunday morning with a smug look on their faces. My stepmother crossed her arms and told me to pack my bags because the house my grandmother left me now belonged to my father. They tried to evict me and throw me out on the street to fund my half-brother's latest failed business venture. What they did not know was that I am a senior partner at a top-tier real estate litigation firm. When I finally showed them exactly who they were dealing with, the color drained from their faces, and the silence in the room was absolute. Before I dive into the details of how I dismantled their entire scheme, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who thought they could walk all over you. My name is Whitney. I am 33 years old. For years, I let my family believe their own narratives about me. I let them assume I was just an underpaid legal secretary struggling to make ends meet in Austin, Texas. They never cared enough to ask about my actual career, so I never bothered to correct them. It was easier to live quietly under their radar than to engage in their constant battles for dominance and status. The house my grandma Beatrice left me is a stunning historic Victorian home right in the heart of the city. It is the kind of multi-million-dollar property that developers constantly leave notes on the door trying to buy. It features original stained glass windows, towering ceilings with intricate crown molding, and a beautiful wraparound porch where Grandma Beatrice used to sit and drink her sweet tea. She was the only person in my family who ever saw my true worth. When she passed away, she made sure this sanctuary went straight to me, protecting me from the greed of her own son. It was a beautiful Sunday morning. I was standing in my kitchen wearing my favorite oversized sweater, enjoying the absolute peace and quiet. The smell of freshly ground coffee filled the air. I was looking out the large bay window at the old oak tree in the backyard, feeling completely relaxed. That peace shattered instantly when the heavy front door burst open with a violent crash. There was no knock. There was no polite phone call to announce their arrival. There was only the sound of heavy footsteps marching down the hardwood hallway, like an invading army coming to conquer a territory. I turned around just as three people marched right into my kitchen. It was my father, Thomas. He is 60 years old and carries himself with an arrogant, patriarchal entitlement that demands everyone bow down to him. Right beside him was his wife Linda, my 55-year-old stepmother. She was wearing a perfectly pressed designer outfit and clutching her luxury handbag like a weapon. Trailing just behind them was my 29-year-old half-brother Brandon. He is the undisputed golden child of the family, despite being a completely failed crypto entrepreneur who burns through our father's money like it is oxygen. He walked in wearing expensive designer sweatpants and a deeply entitled smirk that instantly made my blood boil. My father did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing. He simply marched right up to the marble kitchen island and slammed a thick stack of stapled papers down onto the counter. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet kitchen, startling my cat, who scurried out of the room. I looked down at the papers and then back up at him. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me intimidated. My father puffed out his chest, looking down his nose at me. "It is exactly what it looks like, Whitney. It is a 30-day eviction notice, along with a copy of the newly filed quitclaim deed." He tapped his finger aggressively against the top page. "This house belongs to me now. I suggest you start looking for a small apartment somewhere you can actually afford on your meager salary." I stared at him, taking a slow, steady sip of my coffee. Before I could say another word, Linda stepped forward. She looked around my beautiful kitchen, her eyes scanning the custom cabinetry and the expensive light fixtures with naked, undisguised greed. She let out a short, condescending laugh. "You have had a really nice free ride playing house here, Whitney." She sneered, her tone dripping with absolute disdain. "It was cute for a while, letting you pretend you own a place like this. But the vacation is over. The adults need this property now. You need to start packing your boxes today because we have big plans." Before my father could continue his arrogant speech, Brandon casually tossed his heavy, muddy golf clubs right onto Grandma Beatrice's antique mahogany dining table in the adjoining room. The harsh scraping sound of metal gouging into the polished 100-year-old wood echoed through the house. I felt a visceral spike of pure rage shoot through my veins. That table was my grandmother's most prized possession. She had hosted countless family dinners there, always making sure I had a seat right next to her. Seeing Brandon's careless disrespect seamlessly triggered a painful, vivid flashback that I had tried to bury for years. I was 18 years old, standing in my father's study holding my college acceptance letter. I had worked tirelessly to get into a top university, but my father had coldly looked at me and stated that he was pulling my college tuition fund. He told me that he needed the money to buy Brandon a luxury sports car for his high school graduation because Brandon was the future of the family name. "You are just a girl, Whitney," my father had said, with a dismissive wave of his hand. "You will eventually get married, and your husband will provide for you. Investing a fortune in your education is a waste of resources." I had walked out of his study that day with a shattered heart but a forged spine. I worked 80-hour weeks waiting tables and clerking at a tiny law office to pay off every single cent of my own law school debt. I built an empire with my own two hands while my family praised Brandon for simply existing. Snapping back to the present moment, I watched Brandon pull an apple from my fruit bowl and take a loud, disrespectful bite. "Yeah, sis," he mumbled, chewing with his mouth open. Dad finally found the real paperwork. Turns out Grandma did not actually want to leave this gold mine to a glorified paper pusher. "We are going to sell this place. I have a new business venture launching, and this house is going to provide the perfect seed capital. Try not to be too bitter about it." My father nodded seriously, as if Brandon was a brilliant tech visionary instead of a spoiled man-child who had bankrupted 3 separate companies before his 30th birthday. "I recently uncovered an amended will from your grandmother," my father explained, using his most authoritative booming voice. "It clearly proves that the house was meant to revert to me as the head of the family. It was a terrible oversight that you were allowed to live here this long, but I have already taken the liberty of legally filing the new deed. The county has processed it. You have absolutely no legal standing here anymore, Whitney." My heart beat steadily in my chest. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw my hot coffee in their faces, even though the urge was incredibly strong. Instead, I set my mug down and calmly pulled the thick stack of papers toward me. I flipped open the cover page and looked at the quitclaim deed my father had supposedly filed. They thought I was just a naive legal clerk who fetched coffee-organized files and answered phones. They had absolutely no idea that I spend my days tearing apart complex high-stakes real estate fraud cases for one of the most ruthless litigation firms in the entire state of Texas. My highly trained legal eye scanned the document and immediately began spotting the massive glaring inconsistencies that a layman would never notice. The font used for Grandma Beatrice's supposed signature was completely wrong, lacking the slight distinctive tremor she had developed in her final years. The notary stamp date was placed on a Sunday, a day when the county offices and legitimate notaries in our specific jurisdiction were notoriously unavailable for this type of specific official estate transfer. The legal description of the property boundaries contained a minor but crucial typo that was present in a public tax record, but never in the actual original deed held by the trust. And the embossed seal pressed into the paper looked remarkably like a cheap custom reproduction ordered off the internet. It was a forgery, and it was not even a particularly good one. It was a sloppy, arrogant piece of fraud committed by a man who was so deeply confident in his own superiority that he believed a simple piece of paper would make me cower, apologize, and run away into the night. My father was essentially handing me the very weapon that would completely destroy him. If I called the police right now, it would just be a messy domestic dispute easily swept under the rug by his expensive lawyers. But if I let him continue, if I let him dig this hole deeper and implicate himself fully in federal tax fraud and property theft, the consequences would be inescapable. I needed him to feel perfectly comfortable. I needed him to feel incredibly victorious. I slowly closed the manila file and slid it back across the cool marble counter toward him. I looked at my father, my stepmother, and my smirking half-brother. I let a cold, dead smile spread across my face. 30 days, I said, my voice soft but echoing with a chilling finality. I understand completely. I will start making arrangements today. Linda scoffed, looking incredibly triumphant. Glad to see you are finally being realistic for once in your life. Do not make a mess while you pack your cheap clothes. We have a luxury real estate agent coming to evaluate the property soon, and I want it spotless. My father gave a curt nod, deeply satisfied that his patriarchal authority had successfully crushed my spirit once again. Good. See that you are out of here before the first of the month. Come on, Linda Brandon, we have important meetings to attend. They turned and marched out of my house, leaving the heavy front door wide open behind them. I stood alone in my kitchen, listening to the sound of their luxury SUV pulling out of my driveway and speeding down the street. I walked over to the antique table, picked up Brandon's muddy golf clubs, and dropped them directly into the trash can. I picked up my coffee mug and took another long, satisfying sip. They thought they had just evicted me from my own home. They did not realize they had just walked blindly into a legal guillotine. As my fingers traced the deep, jagged scratch left in the mahogany by Brandon's careless toss of his golf clubs, the physical reality of their invasion settled heavily over me. The sound of their luxury vehicle speeding away faded into the morning air. I stood alone in the kitchen, but my mind violently snapped back to another time, a moment exactly like this one when my father had made it abundantly clear exactly where I stood in his hierarchy. 15 years ago, I stood in his pristine home office, clutching my acceptance letter to a top-tier pre-law program. I was 18 years old and vibrating with pride. I had worked tirelessly to earn that acceptance, and I simply needed him to release the funds from the college savings account my mother had started before she passed away. My father sat behind his massive oak desk, barely looking up from his financial spreadsheets. Without a hint of emotion, he casually informed me that the college fund was gone. He had drained every single cent of it to buy Brandon a brand new luxury sports car for his high school graduation. I remember the exact feeling of the floor dropping out from beneath me. I asked him how he could possibly justify taking my education away to buy a teenager a luxury vehicle. My father finally looked up, his eyes cold and devoid of any parental warmth. "You are just a girl, Whitney," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are going to get a basic job, eventually get married, and your husband will provide for you. Investing a fortune in a serious career for you is a complete waste of family resources. Brandon is the future of our family name. He needs to project success and dominance right out of the gate." I did not cry that day in his office. I walked out of his house with a shattered heart, but an entirely newly forged spine. I took out massive student loans. I worked 80-hour weeks waiting tables at a diner by day and clerking at a tiny legal aid office by night. I studied under the harsh fluorescent lights of the campus library until my eyes burned and my hands cramped. I graduated at the absolute top of my class. I clawed my way up the corporate ladder at one of the most ruthless litigation firms in the state of Texas. I built an undeniable empire with my own two hands and my own intellect, while my father continued to blindly praise Brandon for simply existing. Snapping back to the present moment, I walked over to the kitchen counter and stared down at the stack of papers my father had slammed down. During his arrogant rant, he had shouted about Brandon needing seed capital for a new venture, but the reality was much darker and far more pathetic. My firm employs some of the best private investigators in the state, and I routinely ran background checks on my family just to ensure their liabilities would never cross over into my professional life. I knew exactly why they were suddenly so desperate to steal my home. Brandon had not launched a successful business. He had launched a disastrous cryptocurrency mining farm. He had convinced a group of dangerous private investors to hand over $500,000 based on inflated projections and outright lies. He burned through the entire $500,000 in less than 3 months, spending most of it on lavish parties, private flights, and leased luxury cars to maintain his fake billionaire persona on social media. Now those investors were demanding their money back. They were preparing to file federal fraud charges against the Golden Boy. My father was desperate to cover the massive debt before his precious son ended up in a federal penitentiary. Selling my historic Victorian home for over $2 million would easily cover Brandon's $500,000 disaster and leave plenty of leftover cash for Linda to fund her endless country club memberships. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, pulled out one of the heavy wooden bar stools, and sat down at the kitchen island. I spread the forged quitclaim deed and the eviction notice out under the bright pendant lights. I let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh. The sheer arrogance of these people was truly staggering. They thought I was just a mid-level paper pusher who filed basic documents for a meager salary. They thought I was terrified of complex legal jargon and would simply bow down to a piece of paper that looked vaguely official. I leaned in and examined the documents with the trained eye of a senior partner who destroys fraudulent real estate contracts for a living. I broke down the exact legal errors step by step. First, I looked at the notary stamp. In the state of Texas, a valid notary stamp must contain specific commission details, including an exact expiration date, and a perfectly aligned state seal. The stamp on my father's document was a generic, blurry reproduction, clearly ordered from a novelty website. Second, I checked the date of the supposed signature. The date stamped next to Grandma Beatrice's forged signature was a Sunday. Official county clerk offices and legitimate real estate notaries in our specific jurisdiction are strictly closed on Sundays, making it highly improbable and legally suspicious for an official estate transfer to occur on that exact day. Third, I scrutinized the signature itself. Grandma Beatrice had suffered a minor stroke in her late 70s, which left her with a very slight but highly distinctive downward tremor at the end of her cursive signature. The signature on this deed was perfectly smooth, digitally lifted from an old birthday card and pasted onto the legal document. It lacked the physical indentation of a real pen pressing into paper. Finally, I read the legal description of the property boundaries. My grandmother's original deed contained a very specific historical addendum regarding the eastern boundary line abutting the Old City Preservation Zone. My father had clearly copied and pasted the property description from a flawed online public tax database, which notoriously omitted that exact eastern boundary line. The real deed recorded deep in the secure county courthouse vaults contained the accurate description. It was a forgery. It was a sloppy, desperate, and highly illegal piece of fraud committed by a man so blinded by his own patriarchal superiority that he genuinely believed a fake piece of paper would make me pack my bags, apologize, and run away into the night. Why did I not throw these glaring errors right in his face when he was standing in my kitchen? Why did I simply smile coldly and accept the 30-day eviction notice without putting up a massive fight? Because in the high-stakes legal world, intent and execution are absolutely everything. If I had pointed out the forgery while he was standing there, my father would have instantly snatched the papers back. He would have claimed it was a simple administrative misunderstanding, hired a corrupt defense attorney, and found a different, more insidious way to attack my grandmother's estate. By silently accepting the notice, I gave him the ultimate gift. I gave him enough rope to hang himself entirely. I allowed him to fully execute his crime. He had already proudly admitted to officially filing the fraudulent deed with the county clerk. By doing so, he had crossed the line from a petty civil family dispute straight into a severe federal felony. I wanted him to feel perfectly comfortable. I wanted him to feel incredibly victorious. I wanted Linda to start contacting luxury real estate agents and shopping for new diamond necklaces with money she was absolutely never going to see. I wanted Brandon to boldly brag to his angry investors that he was about to pay them back in full because his rich father had successfully stolen his sister's multi-million-dollar house. I took another long sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, dark roast. The silence of the large Victorian house wrapped around me like a protective shield. Grandma Beatrice had known exactly what she was doing when she left this place to me. She knew her son was consumed by greed, and she knew I was the only one strong enough to protect her legacy. I walked back over to the trash can and looked down at Brandon's expensive muddy golf clubs sticking out of the bin. I left them right there. They were a perfect reminder of exactly who I was dealing with and exactly what was at stake. I had 30 days. I had exactly 1 month to build a legal trap so flawless, so sharp, and so devastatingly public that my father, my stepmother, and my golden child half-brother would never be able to recover their reputations or their finances. I walked into my home office, a room lined with legal volumes and framed degrees they had never bothered to look at. I opened my laptop securely connected to my law firm's private encrypted server and began to draft the absolute destruction of my father's false legacy. The silent ascent was over. It was time to prepare for war. I expected them to wait at least a week before pushing the boundaries. I underestimated their sheer entitlement. It was Monday morning, less than 24 hours after my father had slammed that forged eviction notice onto my kitchen counter. I was sitting in my home office reviewing a massive commercial zoning brief for a client when I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the heavy brass lock of my front door. I froze in my desk chair. I had not given anyone a key to Grandma Beatrice's house. I quietly closed my laptop and stepped out into the hallway just in time to see the heavy oak door swing wide open. Brandon strolled in, holding a shiny new brass key between his fingers, twirling it like a trophy. Behind him were two burly movers carrying massive cardboard boxes, heavily reinforced with thick packing tape. Brandon did not even knock. He just walked right into my foyer, tracking mud onto the vintage Persian rug, and pointed a lazy finger toward the grand staircase. "The guest room is up there on the right," he told the movers, his voice loud and obnoxious. "Try not to drop those boxes. That equipment costs more than this entire house combined." I stood on the landing looking down at him. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Brandon?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm, despite the adrenaline spiking hard in my chest. He looked up and gave me that familiar, infuriating smirk. "Moving in, sis," he announced proudly. "Dad said since you are practically out the door anyway, there is no point in me paying another month of rent at my luxury downtown loft. Plus, my new mining rigs need space, and the ventilation in this old dinosaur of a house is actually pretty decent." I stared at the shiny key in his hand. "Dad gave you a key to my house?" I asked. "It is his house now, Whitney," he replied, brushing roughly past me on the stairs. "And since he is the legal owner, he can give a key to whoever he wants. You should be grateful we are letting you stay the full 30 days. Most landlords would just throw your stuff on the curb today." I followed him up the stairs, maintaining my calculated silence. The guest room was a beautiful sunlit space that Grandma Beatrice had meticulously decorated with vintage floral wallpaper and a handcrafted mahogany bed frame. It was a space preserved with deep love and care. I watched in absolute disgust as Brandon directed the movers to just shove the antique bed frame into the far corner, violently scraping the original hardwood floors in the process. He ripped open the cardboard boxes and began pulling out stacks of heavy metal frames, tangled webs of thick power cables, and dozens of high-end graphic processing units. It was a massive, obnoxiously loud cryptocurrency mining farm. Brandon plugged the first massive tower into the wall, and the machine roared to life, sounding like a commercial jet engine warming up right inside my peaceful, historic home. The harsh heat radiating from the machine was instant and suffocating. Brandon looked around the room, his face crinkling in disgust at the elegant vintage decor. "Get all this junk out of here," he barked at the movers, pointing to the beautiful heirloom quilt my grandmother had sewn by hand. "I need maximum airflow for the cooling fans to optimize my hash rate." Before I could intervene, one of the movers grabbed the quilt, the antique bedside lamps, and a large box containing some of my winter clothes that I stored in the closet. They dumped the entire pile unceremoniously right out into the upstairs hallway. My personal belongings were literally tossed onto the floor like garbage. I stood there looking at the crumpled quilt. The urge to snap my fingers, call the police, and have him arrested for breaking and entering was absolutely suffocating. I wanted to reveal my firm badge, my law license, my entire arsenal of lethal legal weapons, and crush his arrogant tech bro persona into dust right then and there. But I took a deep breath. A master chess player never flips the board when they are only 3 moves away from a devastating checkmate. I bent down silently, picked up the quilt and carried it to my master bedroom. I let the roaring sound of his mining equipment echo through the second floor, playing the role of the defeated submissive sister perfectly. If Brandon was the blunt force trauma of this hostile takeover, my stepmother Linda was the calculated psychological warfare. The very next afternoon, while the unbearable humming of Brandon's machines vibrated through the floorboards, the front door opened again. This time, Linda breezed in unannounced, carrying a sleek leather clipboard and a digital laser measuring tape. She was accompanied by a woman wearing a sharp blazer and holding a massive color swatch book. Linda did not even look at me as she walked past the kitchen island, where I was eating a quick salad for lunch. She spoke loudly to the woman beside her, gesturing vaguely at my kitchen walls. "The layout is incredibly dated, of course," she announced, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We will need to completely gut these cherrywood cabinets. They scream elderly spinster." I am thinking bright white shaker-style cabinets with a waterfall edge quartz countertop and brushed brass hardware. It needs to look modern and expensive to attract the right kind of wealthy tech buyers. I sat perfectly still, taking a bite of my lunch. Linda walked right up to the window directly behind my chair and pointed her laser measuring tape right over my shoulder. "Excuse me, Whitney," she said, her tone dripping with fake politeness. "Could you shift over a bit? You are blocking the natural light, and I need to get the exact dimensions for the new custom blinds. We are staging the house next week, and these heavy velvet drapes simply have to go. They are incredibly depressing." I calmly moved my chair to the side. "Are you planning to start heavy renovations while I am still living here, Linda?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and hesitant, like a frightened tenant facing imminent eviction. Linda let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Oh, honey, we do not have time to wait around for you to pack up your little knickknacks. The market is incredibly hot right now. Your father wants this property listed and sold before the end of the quarter. Brandon desperately needs his seed capital." She patted my shoulder, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. "Do not worry. We will work around you. Just try to stay out of the way when the contractors arrive on Thursday to start ripping up the carpets. You can confine yourself to the master bedroom until your 30 days are up. It will be like living in a cozy little studio apartment. Think of it as good practice for your new life." The psychological pressure over the next 3 days was relentless. It was a masterclass in domestic terrorism designed specifically to make me break, to make me pack my bags early and surrender the territory without putting up a fight. Brandon treated the kitchen like his personal fraternity house, leaving empty, greasy pizza boxes on the marble counters and tossing his sweaty gym clothes over the grand wooden banister. He blasted loud, aggressive music until 2 in the morning, completely ignoring my polite text messages asking him to turn it down. Linda treated my home like an active demolition site, dropping by twice a day, with different aggressive contractors, interior decorators, and eager real estate agents. She would walk them through my living room, pointing at my beautiful furniture and loudly discussing how much better the space would look once all the cheap trash was hauled off to the city dump. She would deliberately leave the front door wide open, letting the harsh Texas heat, high humidity, and buzzing insects fill the beautifully air-conditioned house, claiming she needed to air out the musty old smell. My father did not visit, but his dark, looming presence was felt in every arrogant action his wife and son took. They were acting with the absolute impunity of people who believed they held all the power. They truly believed they had successfully cornered a weak, helpless legal secretary who had no resources, no money, and no backbone to fight back against the wealthy, patriarchal head of the family. What they completely failed to realize was that every empty pizza box, every condescending comment about staging the house, and every unauthorized entry with a forged key was being meticulously documented. I let them measure my windows. I let Brandon run up my electricity bill with his ridiculous crypto mining machines. I let them treat me like a ghost haunting my own home. Because while they were busy playing real estate tycoons, measuring drapes, and picking out quartz countertops, I was busy securing the federal trap that would lock them away for years. The 30-day countdown had started, but it was not counting down to my eviction. It was counting down to their absolute destruction. My fingers tightened around the thick plastic of the trash bag. The physical reality of their invasion settled heavily over me as I stared at the man who was actively trying to erase my grandmother's entire existence. The sound of his expensive sneakers scraping against the original hardwood floors filled the room. I stood alone in my own living room, but my mind violently snapped back to another time, a moment exactly like this one, when my father had made it abundantly clear exactly where I stood in his hierarchy. 15 years ago, I stood in his pristine home office clutching my acceptance letter to a top-tier pre-law program. I was 18 years old and vibrating with pride. I had worked tirelessly to earn that acceptance, and I simply needed him to release the funds from the college savings account my mother had started before she passed away. My father sat behind his massive oak desk, barely looking up from his financial spreadsheets. Without a hint of emotion, he casually informed me that the college fund was gone. He had drained every single cent of it to buy Brandon a brand new luxury sports car for his high school graduation. I remember the exact feeling of the floor dropping out from beneath me. I asked him how he could possibly justify taking my education away to buy a teenager a luxury vehicle. My father finally looked up, his eyes cold and devoid of any parental warmth. "You are just a girl, Whitney," he had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are going to get a basic job, eventually get married, and your husband will provide for you. Investing a fortune in a serious career for you is a complete waste of family resources. Brandon is the future of our family name. He needs to project success and dominance right out of the gate." I did not cry that day in his office. I walked out of his house with a shattered heart, but an entirely newly forged spine. I took out massive student loans. I worked 80-hour weeks waiting tables at a diner by day and clerking at a tiny legal aid office by night. I studied under the harsh fluorescent lights of the campus library until my eyes burned and my hands cramped. I graduated at the absolute top of my class. I clawed my way up the corporate ladder at one of the most ruthless litigation firms in the state of Texas. I built an undeniable empire with my own two hands and my own intellect, while my father continued to blindly praise Brandon for simply existing. Snapping back to the present moment, I watched Brandon reach down and scoop up a handful of loose Polaroids, crinkling the edges in his careless grip. "Who even cares about this stuff anyway?" he muttered, tossing them toward the black plastic bag. "It is just a bunch of dead people and boring family vacations. I need this room cleared out so my investors can see the open floor plan when they come for the viewing party." I stepped directly into his personal space, reaching out and firmly grabbing the heavy plastic bag. "Do not touch another album," I said, my tone dropping an octave, vibrating with a barely contained fury. "I do not care what Linda or your staging company wants. You will not throw away her life." Brandon yanked the bag back, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "Oh, relax, you dramatic paper pusher." He shoved the bag roughly against my chest, forcing me to take a step back to maintain my balance. "You always have to make everything into a massive tragedy, do you not? This is exactly why Dad cannot stand dealing with you. You are so obsessed with the past because your present life is a complete and utter failure." I stood frozen, holding the heavy bag of salvaged memories, staring at the brother who had been handed the world on a silver platter and still managed to destroy everything he touched. "Look at you!" Brandon continued, pacing across the living room, waving his arms in a grand theatrical gesture. "You are 33 years old, you are unmarried, you have no assets, you work 40 hours a week as a glorified secretary filing boring legal documents for what? $40,000 a year. Maybe 50,000 if your boss is feeling generous at Christmas. You sit in a cubicle all day fetching coffee for actual lawyers and typing up their brilliant ideas. You have absolutely nothing to show for your life, Whitney." I tightened my grip on the trash bag, feeling the sharp corner of a picture frame pressing into my palm. I remained perfectly silent, letting him dig his own grave with every arrogant word. "Dad is selling this house for $2.5 million, he bragged, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. "Do you have any idea what kind of money that is? Of course you do not. You have probably never seen more than $5,000 in your bank account at one time. Dad is taking the profits and funneling them directly into my new tech enterprise. He knows a visionary when he sees one. He understands that I am the only person in this family capable of building generational wealth. A visionary. The word echoed in my mind, dripping with supreme irony. This visionary standing before me had launched 3 separate companies using our father's money. The first was a luxury car rental service that folded within 6 months when he failed to secure proper insurance and totaled 2 vehicles. The second was an exclusive networking app that never made it past the beta testing phase because he spent the entire development budget on promotional parties. The third was this current catastrophic cryptocurrency mining farm that was actively plunging him into ruin. He was a walking financial disaster, a black hole of debt and entitlement. Yet my father looked at this string of spectacular failures and saw a brilliant entrepreneur who just needed one more chance. My father looked at me, a woman who had graduated at the top of her law school class, passed the bar exam on the first try, and become a senior partner at a prestigious litigation firm, and saw only a stubborn girl playing at a career. "Do not worry, sis," Brandon said, his tone shifting to mock pity. "I am not completely heartless. Once my new venture takes off and we finalize the sale of this place, I will talk to Dad. We might throw a few $1,000s your way. Maybe we will buy you a nice little 1-bedroom condo in the slums on the east side of town. You know, somewhere closer to the bus line so you can commute to your little desk job. You should be thanking me. I am upgrading your life." I looked at his smug face, his perfectly styled hair, and his expensive watch bought with money he never earned. The stark contrast between the golden child and the scapegoat had never been clearer or more nauseating. I remembered the grueling years of my 20s. I remembered working 80-hour weeks fueled by cheap coffee and sheer desperation. I remembered the crippling anxiety of student loan debt hanging over my head like an anvil. I remembered missing social events, holidays, and sleep because I was busy outworking every single junior associate in my firm. I paid off my massive debt in 3 years. I won my first multi-million-dollar settlement at 28. I bought myself a custom-tailored wardrobe, a luxury vehicle I kept hidden in a private garage, and an investment portfolio that rivaled my father's. I was a self-made millionaire before my 30th birthday. I achieved all of this while my family confidently assumed I was clipping coupons and struggling to pay for groceries. Brandon stepped closer, jabbing a finger toward my shoulder. "So take your stupid little photo albums and go hide in your bedroom until your 30 days are up, and try to stay out of my way. I have real business to handle. Real investors are coming here, and I cannot have you wandering around looking like a depressed librarian, ruining the vibe of the property." I looked down at the trash bag in my arms and then back up at him. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. It was the same smile I used in the deposition room right before I dismantled a hostile witness's entire defense strategy. "You are right, Brandon," I said, my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. "I should definitely take these upstairs. I would hate to ruin the vibe for your real investors." He scoffed, shaking his head and turning his back on me. "Whatever. Just get out of my sight." I turned and walked away, carrying the heavy bag of my grandmother's memories up the grand staircase. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my career. I did not tell him that my supposed $40,000 salary was actually what I billed a wealthy client for a single week of my legal expertise. I did not tell him that I knew all about his angry creditors or the federal tax fraud our father was currently committing to save him from prison. As I reached the landing of the second floor, I paused and looked down at the living room. Brandon was already back on his phone, scrolling aimlessly, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering directly above his head. He truly believed he had won the confrontation. He truly believed he had asserted his dominance and put the worthless sister back in her proper place. I carried the bag into my master bedroom, setting it down gently on my plush rug. I carefully removed each photo album, smoothing out the bent pages and wiping the dust away. I placed them securely in my personal safe, locking the heavy steel door. They were safe now. My grandmother's legacy was safe. I walked over to my desk and opened my encrypted laptop. I pulled up the hidden camera feeds I had installed throughout the common areas of the house. The high-definition video clearly showed Brandon destroying property and arrogantly discussing the sale of my home. The audio captured every single word of his delusional rant. It was beautiful, pristine evidence. They wanted to play a game of power and intimidation. They wanted to treat me like a minor inconvenience to be swept out the door. They had spent their entire lives underestimating me, diminishing my worth, and elevating a golden child who was nothing more than a parasite. They had pushed the scapegoat into a corner, assuming she would simply surrender. I opened a new legal document, typing out a detailed timeline of events. I began cross-referencing Brandon's statements with the financial records I had already subpoenaed through private channels. I was building a fortress of undeniable proof, a labyrinth of legal destruction that they would never be able to escape. The hostility in my home was suffocating, but it was also the exact fuel I needed to sharpen my blades. The golden boy had just handed me the final pieces of the puzzle, and he was too arrogant to even realize he had sealed his own fate. The cameras were a masterpiece of modern discrete technology. I had installed them months ago for basic home security, but recently upgraded the audio receivers the very night my father handed me that forged eviction notice. Tucked invisibly inside the ornate Victorian smoke detectors, nestled behind the antique grandfather clock in the foyer, and seamlessly integrated into the smart home thermostat on the living room wall. These tiny lenses captured every square inch of the common areas in glorious 4K resolution. Under Texas Penal Code, Section 16.02, recording audio is perfectly legal as long as one party to the conversation consents. By sitting quietly in the adjoining open-concept dining room while they occupied my living room, I was legally a party to their ambient conversations. They were in my home, speaking at full volume with no reasonable expectation of privacy. Every single arrogant word they uttered was fully admissible in a court of law. The psychological warfare escalated throughout the week. Linda treated my continued presence like a foul odor she was desperately trying to air out. She would walk into the kitchen while I was making my morning coffee, wearing her expensive silk scarves, and immediately pinch her nose. She would loudly direct her hired interior decorators to ignore the depressing spinster energy of my furniture. She brought in a team of landscapers and stood on the back porch shouting orders to rip up Grandma Beatrice's prized rose bushes, claiming the flowers looked too old-fashioned for the modern tech buyers they wanted to attract. I silently endured every single taunt. When Linda casually knocked my favorite ceramic mug off the counter and offered a fake, insincere apology, I simply grabbed a broom and swept up the shards without a word. When Brandon invited his obnoxious friends over to drink my expensive bourbon and laugh at my conservative work clothes, I kept my head down and continued typing on my laptop, pretending to be intimidated by their loud, aggressive posturing. I played the role of the defeated, submissive scapegoat to absolute perfection. I slumped my shoulders. I avoided direct eye contact. I let my voice tremble just a fraction whenever my father marched through the front door to check on their progress. My calculated weakness was the ultimate drug for their narcissism. It made them sloppy. It made them feel utterly invincible. When predators believe their prey is already dead, they stop checking their surroundings for traps. The golden opportunity arrived on the evening of the 12th day. It was a Thursday night. The relentless Texas heat was beating down against the windows, but inside my home the air conditioning hummed quietly. I was sitting at the heavy oak dining table, wearing a plain gray cardigan, sorting through a stack of meaningless paper files to keep up my facade as an overworked legal secretary. The front door swung open and my father walked in carrying a bottle of expensive champagne. Linda followed close behind him, holding crystal flutes she had undoubtedly raided from my own locked china cabinet. Brandon emerged from the guest room upstairs, the deafening roar of his crypto mining machines momentarily spilling into the hallway before he slammed the door shut. "We have a buyer," my father announced, his booming voice echoing off the high ceilings. He marched directly into the living room, completely ignoring my presence in the dining space just 15 feet away. A venture capital firm out of California. They are willing to pay $2.8 million in cash to convert this entire block into boutique commercial spaces. Brandon pumped his fist in the air, letting out a loud, obnoxious cheer. That is what I am talking about. The investors have been breathing down my neck all week, threatening to file a lawsuit if I do not return their seed money. How fast can we close this deal? Linda began pouring the champagne, the crisp, bubbly liquid catching the light from the chandelier. The market is moving incredibly fast, darling, she purred, handing a glass to Brandon. Your father is brilliant. He completely bypassed the traditional listing process and went straight to his private network. We should have the funds secured before the end of the month. Then we can finally rid ourselves of this depressing house and its depressing occupant. She shot a vicious sidelong glance in my direction, but I kept my eyes firmly glued to the fake legal briefs on the table, pretending I had not heard her insult. My heart was beating with a steady rhythmic precision. I tapped a hidden shortcut key on my laptop, ensuring the security feeds were actively recording and uploading directly to my encrypted cloud server. My father took a long, satisfied sip of his champagne. The buyers are rushing the title search because they want to break ground by the spring, he said, lowering his voice. Just a fraction, but still speaking loudly enough for my high-definition microphones to capture every single syllable. They are not asking too many questions, which is exactly what we need right now. Brandon took a gulp of his drink, leaning back against my expensive velvet sofa. Are we absolutely sure the paperwork is bulletproof, Dad? He asked, a sudden hint of nervous anxiety creeping into his arrogant tone. I mean, what if the county clerk flags the deed? What if those California lawyers start digging into how Grandma supposedly signed the property over to you? I stopped breathing. I kept my hand hovering perfectly still over my paperwork. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for all week. My father let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. Let me worry about the legalities, Brandon. You just focus on getting your chaotic financial ledgers in order so the IRS does not freeze your accounts before we can deposit the cash. But the notary Brandon pressed, pushing the issue. You said the guy was sketchy. What if he talks? What if he realizes how much this house is actually selling for and tries to extort us for more money? My father slammed his crystal glass down onto the coffee table with a sharp, cracking sound. I paid Dennis $50,000 in cash to secure that fake stamp. He snapped, his temper flaring at his son's sudden lack of faith. $50,000 to backdate a single piece of paper and keep his mouth permanently shut. Dennis is a degenerate gambler who lost his official notary license 3 years ago. He is not going to say a word to anyone because if he does, he goes to federal prison for impersonating a state official and participating in real estate fraud. Linda reached out and rubbed my father's shoulder, attempting to soothe his sudden rage. Calm down, Thomas, she murmured soothingly. Brandon is just stressed about his investors. The plan is flawless. Dennis did his job perfectly. The signature looks exactly like your mother's. No one is going to question a grieving son taking control of his rightful family estate. Especially not when the only other person who could challenge it is a pathetic paper pusher who cannot even afford a decent lawyer to fight us. She gestured openly toward the dining room, acknowledging my presence purely to dismiss my threat level. She will pack her cheap bags and move into a rundown apartment just like she always does. We have absolutely nothing to worry about. My father smoothed the lapels of his tailored suit, his aggressive posture relaxing as Linda's flattery fed his massive ego. You are right, my love, he agreed, a smug smile returning to his face. The deed is officially recorded. The title company has preliminary approval. The California buyers are wiring the earnest money deposit tomorrow morning. We have won. The house is mine and Brandon's debts will be completely wiped clean by next week. They raised their glasses in a triumphant toast, the crystal chiming clearly in the quiet house. They drank to their success, to their brilliance, and to their flawless execution of a federal crime. Sitting just 15 feet away in the shadows of the dining room, I slowly released the breath I had been holding. I kept my eyes downcast, playing the part of the broken daughter to the bitter end. I did not flinch. I did not react. I simply reached out and pressed the save button on my keyboard. The audio file was breathtakingly clear. My father had just explicitly confessed to paying a disgraced unlicensed notary named Dennis $50,000 to backdate a forged quitclaim deed. He had openly admitted to participating in real estate fraud. He had detailed his exact plan to sell stolen property to an out-of-state buyer to cover up his son's massive financial liabilities. Linda had openly confirmed the forgery of Grandma Beatrice's signature. Brandon had established clear motive by discussing his angry investors and his desperate need for the funds. It was a pristine, perfectly wrapped gift of criminal evidence. I had captured the entire conspiracy on multiple cameras confirming their identities, their locations, and their exact malicious intent. Any competent prosecutor would salivate over this level of undeniable proof. I quietly closed my laptop, sliding it into my worn, leather briefcase. I stood up from the dining table, keeping my head slightly bowed. The three of them paused their celebration to watch me. They expected me to run upstairs and cry. They expected me to surrender to the overwhelming weight of their victory. I walked silently past the living room, not sparing them a single glance. I climbed the grand staircase, the heavy oak steps absorbing the sound of my footsteps. Let them drink my champagne. Let them measure my windows. Let them celebrate their imaginary millions. They were dancing on the gallows, and they had just handed the executioner the lever. The rope was fully gathered and the trap was perfectly set. It was time to go to work. Monday morning arrived with a crisp, sharp clarity. I did not take the public bus as Brandon had so generously suggested. Instead, I walked 3 blocks from my historic house to a high-end private parking garage, where I kept a custom black Porsche Panamera, secured behind a heavily guarded gated entrance. The engine roared to life, a smooth, powerful purr that stood in stark contrast to the obnoxious noise of Brandon's cheap crypto mining machines. I navigated through the bustling Austin traffic, heading straight for the tallest, sleekest glass skyscraper in the downtown financial district. I bypassed the main lobby, entirely swiping my secure keycard at a discreet side entrance and stepping into the private executive elevator that shot me directly to the 45th floor. The polished silver doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the immaculate sprawling reception area of Crawford & Cole real estate litigation. I am not a legal clerk. I am not a secretary who files paperwork for actual lawyers. I am a senior partner. My name is etched deeply into the frosted glass doors of the main boardroom, and my billing rate is $1,200 an hour. I am the absolute apex predator of Texas real estate fraud, and I have dismantled multi-billion-dollar corporations for attempting exactly the kind of pathetic scheme my father was currently running in my living room. As I walked down the long corridor lined with modern art and dark wood paneling, the entire atmosphere in the office shifted. Junior associates stopped chatting and immediately stood a little straighter. Paralegals quickly moved out of my way, offering highly respectful morning greetings. I nodded politely, projecting the calm, absolute authority that had made me the most feared and respected litigator in the city. I pushed open the heavy, solid oak door to my personal office. It was a massive corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic, unobstructed view of the entire Austin skyline. The space was furnished with custom leather chairs, a sleek, minimalist glass desk, and an expansive polished conference table where I routinely negotiated complex settlements that eclipsed my father's entire net worth. I set my worn leather briefcase down on the desk and walked over to the windows looking out over the sprawling, sunlit city. Somewhere down there in the suburban sprawl, my father was likely having a celebratory breakfast at his exclusive country club, bragging to his wealthy friends about his brilliant real estate acquisition. He had absolutely no idea that he was a tiny, insignificant mouse playing in a deadly maze built entirely by a hawk. There was a sharp knock on my door. My senior associate, David, stepped into the office holding a thick, color-coded binder. "Good morning, Whitney," he said, his tone strictly professional, but carrying a hint of urgency. "Opposing counsel on the commercial property case just sent over their final settlement offer. They are threatening to take the property dispute to trial if we do not accept their terms by noon today." I took the heavy binder from him and flipped open the cover. The opposing firm was trying to enforce a fraudulent commercial lease agreement using backdated signatures and falsified corporate stamps. It was almost poetic how identical it was to my current family situation. I did not even bother to sit down. I grabbed a red pen from my desk and slashed a massive thick line straight through their proposed settlement figure. "Call their lead counsel," I instructed David, my voice hard and unyielding. "Tell them we are absolutely not settling for a single dime. Tell them we have forensic proof that their client used an expired notary stamp, and if they do not drop the claim entirely by 11 o'clock this morning, I am forwarding the entire unredacted file to the district attorney for criminal fraud charges." David smiled a sharp, predatory grin that perfectly mirrored my own. "I will make the call right now," he said eagerly, taking the binder back. "They are going to absolutely panic. They actually thought they had us cornered. People always think they have the upper hand when they assume you are too weak to fight back," I replied, finally sitting down at my expansive desk. "Make sure they clearly understand that Crawford and Cole does not negotiate with criminals." David nodded respectfully and left the office, closing the heavy door silently behind him. I was alone again. The high-stakes corporate victory took less than 3 minutes to execute and earned my firm a staggering fee. Yet my family genuinely believed my highest career aspiration was fetching coffee and typing dictations. The sheer profound absurdity of their assumptions was almost intoxicating. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, pressing my fingers to my temples. I thought about Brandon mocking my supposed $40,000 salary just 2 days ago. I generated that exact amount of revenue for my firm before lunch on a slow Tuesday. My personal investment portfolio, managed by a highly discreet wealth management group in New York, was robust enough that I could have comfortably retired at 30. The historic Victorian house was not my only physical asset, it was simply the one with the most sentimental value. I owned a luxury penthouse downtown that I leased to traveling tech executives, and a beautiful secluded lake house property that I used for quiet weekend escapes. I had built an absolute fortress of financial security entirely on my own, while my father blindly drained his retirement accounts to bail out Brandon's endless string of embarrassing failures. I did not just have a nice desk and a fast computer, I wielded immense power. I had an entire dedicated team of ruthless, highly trained legal professionals at my absolute disposal. I had forensic accountants on retainer who could trace a single stolen dollar through a massive maze of offshore shell companies. I had private investigators composed of former federal agents who could unearth a person's darkest secrets in a matter of hours. I had a deep network of judges, politicians, and corporate titans who answered my calls on the first ring. My father thought he was untouchable because he was a wealthy man in a nice suit. He did not comprehend that in the real halls of power, a man like him was nothing more than a noisy, vulnerable nuisance. I specialize in real estate fraud. It is a highly specific, complicated niche of the legal world that requires a predatory mindset and an encyclopedic knowledge of property law. I have seen every scam, every forged signature, and every desperate, pathetic attempt to steal generational wealth. People commit these crimes because they firmly believe the victims are too ignorant to notice, or too impoverished to fight back in civil court. My father had heavily relied on both of those arrogant assumptions. He had calculated the risk and decided that his quiet, estranged daughter lacked the financial means to hire a lawyer to contest the eviction. He assumed I would simply accept the fake quitclaim deed as an impenetrable legal shield. But I was not going to fight him in civil court where wealthy men can drag out proceedings for years and drain their opponents through endless legal fees. I was going to drop a federal anvil directly on his head. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner on my desk, booting up my secure encrypted workstation. I bypassed the firm's main server and logged directly into my private cloud database. The files from the hidden cameras in Grandma Beatrice's house were already organized and categorized by time and date. I clicked on the high-definition audio file from the previous night and put on my noise-canceling headphones. The crisp, clear sound of my father explicitly bragging about bribing the disgraced notary filled my ears. I listened to Linda maliciously planning my eviction and Brandon whining about his angry California investors. Hearing it again in the cold, sterile environment of my corporate office stripped away any lingering familial emotion. I was no longer listening to my father, my stepmother, or my half-brother. I was listening to three hostile targets who had just blindly handed me a signed recorded confession. I minimized the audio file and opened a blank legal document. My fingers flew across the keyboard, translating raw fury into cold, precise legal strategy. I began drafting the rigid framework of the trap. I did not just want to invalidate the forged deed and keep my house. That was basic defensive legal work suitable for a first-year associate fresh out of law school. I wanted complete, total, and permanent destruction of their ability to ever threaten me again. I wanted my father to lose his elite country club standing and face the sheer terror of an orange jumpsuit. I wanted Linda to face brutal public humiliation among her wealthy, shallow socialite friends. I wanted Brandon to finally realize that his golden child status meant absolutely nothing when staring down the barrel of federal prison time. They had pushed the wrong woman into a corner, and I was going to dismantle their entire reality piece by piece. I pressed the intercom button on my sleek glass desk, connecting directly to the forensic accounting department on the 42nd floor. Within 10 minutes, my lead financial investigator, Harrison, walked into my office. Harrison is a former federal criminal investigator who left the public sector for the highly lucrative world of corporate litigation. He possesses an uncanny lethal ability to trace hidden funds across international borders and through the most convoluted corporate structures. I did not give him any emotional context or unnecessary family history. I simply handed him a heavy cardstock paper with the legal names of my father and my half-brother, along with the specific limited liability company names Brandon had proudly bragged about over the years. I told Harrison to tear their financial lives apart and look for the bleeding. As Harrison set to work in his secure lab, I utilized my own high-level clearance to access specialized property databases strictly restricted to senior legal professionals and state investigators. I started pulling the historical deed transfers, tax assessment records, and municipal liens associated with every single commercial and residential property my father had ever touched. Growing up, my father had always ruthlessly projected the image of a titan of industry, a self-made multimillionaire, who built his wealth through shrewd traditional investments and absolute discipline. But as the digital documents populated on my glowing screen, a very different, highly pathetic picture began to emerge. His supposed real estate empire was a crumbling house of cards, heavily leveraged to the absolute brink of collapse. He had taken out massive secondary mortgages on his most profitable commercial properties to sustain Linda's extravagant country club lifestyle and to repeatedly fund Brandon's endless parade of catastrophic failures. By early afternoon, Harrison returned to my office carrying a thick, encrypted tablet. He closed the heavy oak door behind him and locked it, a standard, strict protocol when dealing with severe criminal findings. Harrison did not look amused. He looked like a wolf that had just found a wounded, bleeding deer in the snow. He placed the tablet on my desk and pulled up a complex, tangled web of financial flowcharts highlighted in harsh red ink. "Your targets are not just phenomenally bad at business. Whitney," he said, pointing to a massive cluster of red lines connecting my father's primary holding company to Brandon's defunct luxury car rental service. "They are actively engaged in systematic federal tax fraud, and they are leaving a paper trail so incredibly wide a first-year auditing student could spot it." I leaned forward, examining the intricate web of wire transfers and corporate shell games. Harrison methodically explained the mechanics of the scheme. Whenever one of Brandon's ridiculous amateur businesses inevitably failed, my father did not just bail him out with a personal check. Instead, my father was actively using those failing companies as highly illegal tax shelters. He was deliberately funneling large sums of his own untaxed corporate profits into Brandon's dying limited liability companies, writing them off as massive business losses to drastically reduce his own federal tax burden. He was essentially using his golden child's utter incompetence as a highly illegal financial shield against the Internal Revenue Service. He was creating phantom consulting fees and wildly inflated equipment depreciation schedules to hide his own assets. But the cryptocurrency mining farm was the fatal arrogant error. Harrison swiped to a new screen displaying a heavily redacted federal notice obtained through his specialized network. My father had gotten entirely too greedy. He had attempted to funnel over $1 million of untaxed revenue into Brandon's noisy, chaotic cryptocurrency scheme, claiming it as a depreciating digital asset loss. The sheer, unprecedented volume of the transaction had automatically triggered a severe red flag within the automated federal auditing system. The Internal Revenue Service had quietly opened an active criminal investigation into my father's primary holding company 3 months ago. They were currently preparing to issue a massive multi-million-dollar tax lien against all of his personal and commercial assets, effectively freezing his entire life. The realization hit me with the physical force of a freight train. The puzzle pieces instantly locked into perfect, terrifying clarity. My father was not frantically selling Grandma Beatrice's historic home just to protect Brandon from some angry private investors. He was desperately liquidating a stolen asset to generate clean, untraceable cash to pay off the impending federal tax penalty before the Criminal Investigation Division brought the hammer down and seized everything he owned. He needed the $2.8 million to cover up his own massive felony. Selling my home was not a noble fatherly rescue mission for a struggling son. It was a desperate, frantic attempt to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary. A profound, icy calm washed over my entire body. For my entire life, I had internalized the toxic narrative that my father was a superior, infallible being. I had allowed his harsh judgments to dictate my self-worth. I had believed that his financial success somehow validated his cruelty toward me. Looking at the undeniable digital proof of his pathetic criminal desperation, the final lingering illusion of the powerful patriarch completely evaporated. He was not a titan. He was a common white-collar criminal scrambling in the dirt to cover his tracks, and he was cowardly enough to sacrifice his own daughter's home to save his own skin. I instructed Harrison to compile every single piece of evidence into a secure, localized, encrypted hard drive. I needed perfectly certified copies of the bank transfers, the fraudulent tax write-offs, the corporate filings, and the federal audit notifications. I wanted the financial forensics packaged so tightly and undeniably that a federal prosecutor could secure a grand jury indictment in a single afternoon. Harrison nodded, understanding the precise lethal nature of the request. He promised to have the fully certified dossier sitting on my desk by the end of the day. Now I possessed two separate but equally devastating weapons. I had the high-definition audio and video recordings of the three of them openly confessing to state-level real estate fraud and bribery in my dining room. And I had the forensic financial data proving massive federal tax evasion. The absolute beauty of the situation was the deadly synergy of their crimes. The very act of selling the stolen house to cover the tax fraud compounded their legal jeopardy exponentially. The moment they accepted the wired funds from the buyers, they would be committing federal wire fraud, crossing state lines with stolen money, making it an automatic federal jurisdiction. They were literally building their own federal case. I could have ended it right then. I could have placed a single phone call to my powerful contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, handed over the encrypted hard drive, and watched heavily armed agents raid my father's country club by dinner time. I could have sent the police to my house to drag Brandon out of the guest room in handcuffs. But that would be too quick. That would allow them to claim they were simply victims of a misunderstanding or poor accounting advice. It would allow Linda to play the weeping, innocent wife. I needed them to fully commit. I needed them to stand in the absolute blinding spotlight of their own arrogant pride and voluntarily put their necks into the noose. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to strip away my dignity and parade their victory in front of the world. I was going to let them build the stage for their own public execution. I looked out the massive windows of my corner office, the bright Austin sun reflecting harshly off the surrounding glass skyscrapers. The 30-day countdown was ticking loudly in my mind. They were back at the house, measuring my windows, ordering modern cabinetry, and drinking my champagne. They were treating my grandmother's legacy like an ATM machine. They were blissfully unaware that the quiet, obedient legal clerk they thought they had so easily crushed was currently holding the absolute power to legally obliterate their entire bloodline. I closed the financial files on my encrypted monitor and locked my workstation. I picked up my suit jacket and my leather briefcase. The foundation of the trap was completely reinforced with federal steel. There was no escape for them now. Every move they made toward selling the house only tightened the snare. It was time to head back to the Victorian house and play my part. It was time to act like the broken, defeated daughter they so desperately wanted me to be. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for right up until the moment I took everything away. Driving back to the historic neighborhood, my mind was operating with cold mechanical precision. I rehearsed the exact posture, the exact tone of voice, and the exact expressions of despair I would need to project. If my father or Linda sensed even a fraction of the power I truly held, they might panic and attempt to flee or hide assets. I needed them arrogant. Arrogance breeds monumental mistakes. I pulled my Porsche into a secured off-site garage and walked the remaining 3 blocks to my house, ensuring they would only see me arriving on foot, precisely like the impoverished, struggling tenant they envisioned. I let my shoulders slump. I practiced a look of mild panic. I walked up the steps of my beautiful wraparound porch, inserted my key, and prepared to step back into the war zone. The apex predator was putting on her sheep costume. I pushed the heavy oak door open, letting my shoulders droop perfectly, executing the posture of a woman whose entire world had just collapsed. The contrast between the roaring fire of absolute power burning in my chest and the pathetic, defeated exterior I was projecting was almost dizzying. Inside my worn leather briefcase, tucked safely in a hidden compartment, sat the single most destructive piece of paper my father would ever encounter. It was the original certified charter of the Beatrice Harrington Irrevocable Corporate Trust. Years ago, when my grandmother first realized the true depths of my father's greed, she came to me in secret. I was just a junior associate at the time, but I already knew exactly how to build an impenetrable legal fortress. We sat at the very dining table Brandon had just scratched, and we drafted a masterpiece. We transferred the deed of this historic Victorian home directly into a blind corporate trust, making me the sole executor and primary beneficiary upon her death. The house did not belong to Whitney the individual. It belonged to a highly protected corporate entity recognized by the state and shielded by layers of complex asset protection laws. By legally filing a forged quitclaim deed against a property owned by a corporate trust, my father had not just committed standard state-level real estate fraud. He had actively attempted to defraud a registered corporate entity, crossing a massive legal threshold. He had unknowingly handed me the exact statutory requirements needed to elevate this from a civil dispute into a severe federal offense that carried mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. He thought he was simply stealing a house from his submissive, underachieving daughter. He was actually attempting a hostile takeover of a corporate asset and creating a direct, undeniable paper trail of federal tax evasion to cover it up. I walked into the kitchen where Brandon had left another stack of greasy takeout containers on the marble island. A puddle of spilled soda was slowly dripping onto the hardwood floor. I did not clean it up. A defeated woman facing imminent eviction does not care about dirty countertops or sticky floors. I needed to sell this performance with absolute Oscar-worthy dedication. Every movement, every sigh, every hesitation had to convince them that my spirit was entirely broken. I retrieved 3 empty cardboard boxes from the basement and carried them up the grand staircase. I made sure to walk heavily, letting my feet drag, dropping the boxes onto the master bedroom floor with a loud, deliberate thud. I wanted the sound to echo down the hallway where Brandon was running his loud, obnoxious mining machines. I began packing exactly the way a broken, terrified person would. I did not pack my expensive tailored power suits, my high-end electronics, or the luxury watches I kept hidden in my safe. I packed cheap paperbacks, faded framed photographs, and sentimental, worthless trinkets. I left the cardboard boxes open and highly visible near the doorway of my bedroom. I wanted my father and Linda to walk past my room and see the physical manifestation of my supposed surrender. I wanted them to see the pathetic reality of a woman packing her meager life into cheap cardboard boxes. I even made sure to leave a few crumpled tissues scattered on the nightstand, a masterful touch to imply I had spent the entire night crying over my impending homelessness. I changed out of my professional attire, slipping into a faded, oversized college sweatshirt and loose sweatpants. I pulled my hair back into a messy, haphazard knot, stripping away any remaining trace of the high-powered corporate litigator who commanded $1,000 an hour. Looking in the mirror, I saw exactly what they wanted to see: a victim. The trap required fresh bait, and Linda was all too eager to bite. Shortly after 2 in the afternoon, the front door swung open without a knock. I heard the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Linda's expensive designer heels echoing against the hardwood floors, followed by the heavier, softer steps of a stranger. I walked to the top of the grand staircase and peered down into the foyer, clutching the wooden banister with white knuckles. Linda was standing there, pointing grandly at the original crystal chandelier while speaking to a tall, impeccably groomed man holding a sleek leather portfolio. "This is Marcus," she announced, spotting me on the landing, her voice ringing with sheer theatrical arrogance. "He is the top luxury real estate broker in the city. He specializes in multi-million-dollar historic renovations for tech executives. We are doing a preliminary walkthrough today to establish the listing price and staging requirements. Try not to get in our way, Whitney. We have real business to conduct." I walked slowly down the stairs, keeping my eyes averted, hugging my arms tightly across my chest. I guided myself toward the kitchen, making sure to look at the floor rather than making direct eye contact with the broker. Linda led Marcus through the formal dining room, gesturing dismissively at my antique furniture. "As you can see, Marcus, the space has incredible bones, but it is currently cluttered with an atrocious amount of depressing thrift store garbage," she told him, speaking loud enough for me to hear every single cruel syllable. "Once we clear out the current occupants' belongings and knock down these dividing walls, the natural light will really sell the open concept potential. We need it completely empty by the first of the month." Marcus nodded politely, making notes on his digital tablet, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamic, but too motivated by the massive commission to object. I stood by the kitchen sink, gripping the edge of the counter, letting my hands tremble just slightly. The cool marble grounded me, reminding me of the absolute power I held in my briefcase upstairs. Linda walked into the kitchen, Marcus trailing behind her. She opened my refrigerator, wrinkled her nose in disgust, and shut it aggressively. "We will need to replace all these appliances immediately," she instructed Marcus, not even acknowledging my presence. "Buyers at this price point expect commercial-grade stainless steel and smart home integration, not these basic middle-class machines." The whole kitchen screams poverty. I finally looked up at her, summoning every ounce of my theatrical training. I forced my shoulders to slump further. I let my voice waver, projecting a flawless mixture of fear, anxiety, and quiet desperation. "Linda," I said softly, interrupting her rant about quartz countertops, "I have been looking at apartments online all morning, but the deposit requirements are so high. The 30 days Dad gave me is not enough time to save up the cash for first and last month's rent. Rents in Austin have skyrocketed. Where exactly am I supposed to go?" Linda stopped completely. She turned slowly to face me, a look of pure, unadulterated joy spreading across her heavily Botoxed features. This was the exact moment she had been waiting for since the day she married my father. The moment she could finally look down upon her husband's stubborn, independent daughter and crush her like a helpless insect. She let out a sharp, genuinely amused laugh that bounced off the high kitchen ceiling. It was a cruel, piercing sound that contained zero empathy. She looked me up and down, taking in my oversized sweatshirt, my messy hair, and my supposed terror. "That sounds like a you problem, sweetie," she sneered, her eyes glittering with absolute malice. "Maybe you can find a nice little room at the local YMCA, or perhaps you can sleep in your car, assuming it actually runs. Frankly, I do not care if you have to pitch a tent under the highway overpass." She stepped closer, invading my personal space, the heavy scent of her expensive perfume suffocating the air between us. This house is being listed and you are entirely on your own. Do not expect a single dime from your father to bail you out of your own financial incompetence. He is done supporting dead weight. You should have thought about your future instead of working a dead-end secretarial job. Now excuse us, we have a multi-million-dollar listing to prepare. She turned her back to me, linking her arms seamlessly through the real estate brokers and guiding him toward the backyard patio doors. I need to show you the space where we are planning to install the outdoor kitchen, Marcus, she said, her voice returning to its breezy, confident tone. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen listening to them discuss tearing up my grandmother's prized garden. I did not move until the heavy glass patio doors clicked shut behind them. I turned my face toward the window, ensuring the hidden camera tucked inside the smoke detector could not catch my expression. Because the moment Linda turned her back, my terrified, trembling facade completely vanished. I smiled, a cold, brilliant, genuinely euphoric smile. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with the pure, intoxicating rush of impending victory. She had taken the bait perfectly, swallowing the hook, the line, and the heavy lead sinker. They felt zero remorse. They possessed zero hesitation. They were charging headfirst into a federal trap, blinded by their own insatiable toxic greed. Every cruel word she had just spoken, every arrogant command she had given the broker, was locked securely in my encrypted cloud server. I walked back upstairs, leaving the kitchen behind. I looked at the open cardboard boxes sitting on my bedroom floor. I did not need to pack anything else. The illusion was fully cemented in their minds. The stage was flawlessly set. The enemies were completely blind. All that was left was to let my father throw his arrogant little party, let him gather all his wealthy investors into my home, and then casually lock the heavy iron doors behind them. The very next morning, the sheer magnitude of my father's arrogance reached an entirely new level. I was sitting at my small desk in the master bedroom reviewing digital case files when the sound of heavy commercial trucks rumbling up my driveway broke the silence. I walked to the window and looked down at the circular drive. 3 massive, pristine white vans bearing the logo of Austin's most exclusive high society catering company were parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn. Workers in crisp black uniforms were already unloading polished silver chafing dishes, towering floral arrangements composed of white orchids and crates of expensive crystal glassware. My father had decided that simply listing the stolen property on the open market was taking too much time. He was a man who craved immediate gratification and required constant public validation of his superiority. He had decreed that waiting for standard real estate showings was beneath him. Instead, he was going to bypass the traditional market entirely and host a lavish, exclusive pre-sale cocktail party right inside my grandmother's historic home. I slipped out of my room and stood quietly at the top of the grand staircase, listening to him outline his masterful strategy to Linda and Brandon in the foyer below. The acoustics of the Victorian hallway amplified his booming, confident voice perfectly into my hidden recording devices. We are not waiting for some random couple with a conventional mortgage to slowly fall in love with the crown molding, my father declared, pacing across the vintage rugs. We are bringing the absolute top tier of Austin directly into this living room tonight. I have invited the entire executive board from the country club, 3 different private equity managers, and a dozen independent venture capitalists. We get them in here, we pour premium scotch down their throats, and we create a silent, aggressive bidding war before the property ever hits the public listing service. A quiet private cash sale is exactly what we need to bypass any unnecessary bureaucratic red tape with the county clerk's office. He was once again openly admitting to structuring a high-dollar real estate transaction specifically to evade government scrutiny. He was practically gift-wrapping his own federal indictment with a neat little bow. Linda clapped her hands together, a sound of pure materialistic delight. "It is absolutely brilliant, Thomas," she gushed, spinning around to admire the floral arrangements the caterers were hauling through the front door. "I told the event planners to spare absolutely no expense. We need the house to look like a multi-million-dollar asset." I ordered the beluga caviar, the wagyu beef sliders, and an open bar stocked strictly with top-shelf liquor. This is going to be the social event of the season. I watched from the shadows as my father pulled out a heavy platinum credit card and handed it to the catering manager to cover the exorbitant deposit. I made a mental note to subpoena those exact credit card statements. He was actively financing a luxury gala to sell a stolen asset using funds that were already heavily scrutinized by the Internal Revenue Service. It was a spectacular display of financial suicide. Brandon emerged from the kitchen holding a freshly printed stack of glossy real estate brochures. He looked uncharacteristically nervous, his usual smug demeanor replaced by a jittery, frantic energy. He cornered our father near the dining room entrance, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent whisper that my upgraded microphones picked up with crystal-clear precision. "Dad, you are absolutely sure one of these country club guys is going to write a check tonight, right?" Brandon asked, shifting his weight anxiously from foot to foot. "Because I invited Marcus and his partners. They are the guys who fronted the $500,000 for the crypto farm. They have been calling my cell phone every single hour. They are demanding to see physical proof that I actually have the capital to pay them back. I told them this entire party is basically a showcase of their collateral." My father's face darkened instantly. He grabbed Brandon by the shoulder of his expensive designer polo shirt, pulling him close. "You invited your volatile, shady investors to my exclusive networking event," he hissed. His teeth clenched in anger. "I had to, Dad." Brandon shot back, his voice cracking with genuine panic. "You do not understand these guys. They are not just regular bankers. They are threatening to show up at my apartment and break my legs if I do not produce the money. I need them to walk through this house, look at the wealthy buyers you brought in, and understand that the cash is coming." My father released his grip, taking a deep breath to compose his pristine image. "Fine," he snapped, smoothing his tailored suit jacket. "Let your thugs wander around and eat the caviar. Just keep them away from my private equity contacts. Tonight is about projecting absolute flawless success. We secure a buyer tonight. We take the earnest money deposit tomorrow morning, and we pay off your disastrous debts before the weekend. After that, I never want to hear about this crypto garbage again." The sheer scale of the disaster they were orchestrating was breathtaking. My father was inviting the most elite, influential members of his social circle into a house he did not legally own. Brandon was bringing in dangerous, volatile creditors who were desperate to recoup their lost investments. And Linda was treating the entire volatile powder keg like her own personal debutante ball, spending thousands of dollars on imported flowers and champagne. They were packing a historic wooden house full of explosives and handing out matches at the door. For the rest of the afternoon, I remained confined to the second floor, playing the part of the terrified, unwanted tenant to absolute perfection. The noise level in the house grew deafening as dozens of workers transformed the space. Furniture was aggressively shoved aside. Heavy velvet curtains were unceremoniously ripped down to expose the large bay windows. The distinct smell of expensive catering filled the hallways, completely erasing the familiar, comforting scent of my grandmother's lavender and polished wood. Linda marched up the stairs around 4 o'clock, rapping her knuckles sharply against my closed bedroom door. I did not answer, but she pushed the door open anyway, stepping into my space with an expression of supreme distaste. "The guests will begin arriving at 7 sharp," she announced, looking pointedly at the cardboard boxes I had deliberately left scattered across the floor. "I am having the caterers set up a secondary bar on the upstairs landing to encourage the buyers to tour the master suite. You need to take your depressing little boxes and shove them deep into the back of your closet. I will not have my husband's wealthy investors walking up here and seeing this pathetic mess. It completely ruins the high-end aesthetic we are paying a fortune to project." I sat on the edge of my bed wearing faded sweatpants and looking down at my hands. "I am trying to pack as fast as I can, Linda," I said, my voice soft and deliberately wavering. "There is just so much to organize." "Well, pack faster," she snapped, turning on her heel. "And make sure you keep your door firmly shut during the party. Nobody wants to look at a squatter while they are drinking vintage champagne." She slammed the door behind her, leaving me alone in the sudden silence of my bedroom. I stood up from the bed and walked over to my secure locked briefcase. I pulled out my encrypted laptop and checked the live feeds from the hidden cameras one final time. The event staff had set up a massive ice sculpture in the center of the dining room. A jazz quartet was currently tuning their instruments on the back patio. The house looked like a spread from a luxury lifestyle magazine. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the Texas landscape, the first luxury vehicles began pulling into the long circular driveway. I stood out of sight behind the sheer curtains of my bedroom window, watching the spectacle unfold. Sleek black town cars, heavily tinted sports utility vehicles, and imported sports cars lined the street. Valets in crisp white shirts rushed to open doors for men wearing bespoke tailored suits and women draped in designer cocktail dresses and expensive jewelry. This was my father's inner circle. These were the managing directors, the bank presidents, the country club board members, and the local politicians he had spent decades brown-nosing and manipulating to maintain his status as a local titan of industry. He was bringing every single person he wanted to impress directly into the kill zone. I watched Brandon pacing near the front gates. A matte black heavy-duty truck pulled up and three men stepped out. They did not wear tailored suits. They wore dark leather jackets and carried themselves with a heavy, aggressive swagger that completely clashed with the refined country club aesthetic. These were undoubtedly the crypto investors Brandon had defrauded. I watched as Brandon rushed up to them, gesturing frantically toward the grand facade of the Victorian house, visibly sweating as he tried to placate their obvious anger. Inside, the volume of the party began to swell. The smooth sounds of the jazz quartet drifted up the staircase, mingling with the clinking of crystal glasses and the low, arrogant hum of wealthy people discussing their investment portfolios. The trap was now completely full. Every single player was on the board. The victims, the predators, the ignorant bystanders, and the desperate creditors were all trapped inside the walls of Grandma Beatrice's house. I knew exactly what was coming next. My father was a creature of absolute predictable habit. He would not be satisfied simply showing off the property. He would want to demonstrate his total dominance over every aspect of his life. He would need a prop to elevate his own status in front of his elite peers. He would not allow me to simply hide in my bedroom while he basked in the glory of his stolen wealth. He would demand that I come downstairs and serve him. He would want his wealthy friends to see his rebellious, disappointing daughter finally brought to heel, acting as nothing more than the hired help in the house she once thought she owned. I walked away from the window and moved toward the heavy oak doors of my master closet. I reached past the cheap cotton sweaters and faded jeans I had strategically placed near the front. Deep in the back, hidden safely inside a protective garment bag, hung a $3,000 bespoke-tailored midnight blue power suit. It was cut with lethal razor-sharp precision, designed specifically for the moments when I needed to walk into a federal courtroom and completely obliterate the opposition. The preparations were over. The arrogant enemies were drinking champagne on the main floor, entirely blind to the financial and legal massacre hovering just inches above their heads. I unzipped the garment bag and pulled out the suit. It was time to stop playing the defeated daughter and remind them exactly whose house they were standing in. I had barely brushed my fingers against the crisp, dark fabric of the suit when the heavy brass handle of my bedroom door violently twisted. There was no knock. There was no polite request for entry. I shoved the garment bag deep into the shadows of the closet and swiftly pulled the wooden louvered doors shut just a fraction of a second before my father barged into the room. He stood in the doorway looking like a king surveying a newly conquered and utterly defeated province. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal tuxedo with a silk lapel that caught the dim light of my bedroom. His silver hair was impeccably styled, and a smug, triumphant flush colored his cheeks. It was the distinct glow of a narcissist who had spent the last hour consuming expensive scotch and basking in the unearned admiration of his peers. He looked down his nose at me, his eyes sweeping over my faded sweatpants and the messy knot of hair on top of my head. His gaze then shifted to the cheap cardboard boxes I had deliberately scattered across the floor. A cruel, satisfied smile spread across his face. "I am glad to see you are finally taking this eviction seriously, Whitney," he said, his booming voice filling the quiet space of my room. "It is about time you accepted reality." I kept my head slightly bowed, maintaining the illusion of the broken daughter. I clasped my hands together in front of me, making sure my shoulders remained slumped. "Is there something you need, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and deliberately hesitant. "I am trying to finish packing like Linda asked." My father stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. The muffled sounds of the jazz quartet and the low hum of wealthy party guests vibrating through the floorboards were momentarily cut off. He did not come upstairs to check on my packing progress. He had a very specific, very malicious purpose for interrupting my isolation. He held out his left hand. Clutched in his fingers was a cheap, stiff, black cotton apron, the kind worn by the temporary catering staff currently circulating through my dining room downstairs. He tossed it unceremoniously onto my bed. It landed right next to my pillow like a dark stain. "Put that on," he ordered, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for negotiation. "We have a situation downstairs and you are going to make yourself useful for once in your miserable life." I looked at the black apron and then back up at him, allowing a look of manufactured confusion to cross my face. "I do not understand," I said, playing the part flawlessly. "You want me to wear a catering apron?" My father crossed his arms over his broad chest. The event planners severely underestimated the turnout. He explained, his annoyance palpable. "I invited the absolute top tier of the local financial sector, and apparently, word got around about the exclusivity of the property. We have 2 bank presidents, a dozen venture capitalists, and several managing directors from top private equity firms currently standing in our living room. The catering staff is completely overwhelmed. They do not have enough servers to pass the hors d'oeuvres and keep the champagne glasses filled. You are going to go down there and help them." I let my eyes widen, projecting pure manufactured panic. "You want me to serve food to your friends?" I asked, my voice trembling with artificial anxiety. "Dad, please do not make me do that. I am not dressed for a party. I am not comfortable around those kinds of people. You know I get nervous in large crowds." This was the exact reaction he wanted. His chest puffed out even further, entirely validated by my supposed weakness. "I do not care about your comfort, Whitney," he snapped, stepping closer to me, his imposing height designed to intimidate. "You have been living in this historic multi-million-dollar property completely rent-free for years. You have been playing house while contributing absolutely nothing to the family legacy. It is time you finally earned your keep. You are going to put that apron over your clothes, march down those stairs, and pass the Wagyu beef sliders to the men who actually run this city." The sheer audacity of his demand was breathtaking. It was not enough that he had forged a federal document to steal my home. It was not enough that he was actively committing tax fraud to cover his son's catastrophic debts. He needed to physically parade me in front of his elite peers as a servant. He wanted his wealthy friends to see his disappointing, estranged daughter brought to heel, reduced to carrying a silver tray and picking up their discarded napkins. It was a calculated, deliberate act of psychological destruction meant to reinforce my position at the absolute bottom of the family hierarchy. "Look at your brother." My father continued, his voice dripping with misplaced pride. "Brandon is downstairs right now negotiating with high-net-worth individuals. He is entertaining men who control billions in capital. He is projecting vision and leadership. He is proving that he has what it takes to carry the family name into the next generation. And what are you doing? You are hiding in your bedroom, packing your cheap clothes into cardboard boxes because you failed to build a meaningful career." I stared at him, letting his brutal words wash over me. If he only knew the truth. If he only knew that I sat in boardrooms negotiating settlements that dwarfed the combined net worth of every single man currently standing in my living room. If he only knew that Brandon was actively sweating through his designer shirt, terrified that his violent crypto investors were going to break his legs before the night was over. "You are a 33-year-old legal clerk who fetches coffee for a living." My father sneered, his absolute disdain for my supposed profession completely undisguised. Serving food to my guests is hardly a step down from your current corporate status. In fact, it might be the most valuable networking opportunity you have ever had. Maybe if you show some humility and a good work ethic, one of my partners might offer you a filing job at a real company. I forced a single tear to well up in the corner of my eye, a masterful physical reaction that I had perfected during grueling trial preparations. Dad, please, I whispered, looking down at the floor. It is humiliating. Linda already told everyone I am being evicted. If I go down there as a waitress, they will laugh at me. My father did not soften. His eyes remained as cold and unyielding as granite. That is exactly the point, Whitney. You need a harsh lesson in humility. You have always been far too stubborn and far too independent for your own good. You isolated yourself from this family because you thought you were better than us. Now you are facing the real world, and the real world does not care about your fragile feelings. You are going to go down there, and you are going to serve my guests with a smile on your face. You will address them as Sir and Ma'am. You will not make eye contact unless spoken to. You will stay out of the main conversations and you will keep their glasses full. He stepped back, pointing a stiff authoritative finger directly at my face, delivering the final brutal ultimatum. If you refuse to put that apron on, I am not giving you 30 days to vacate this property. I will call the local precinct right now. I will show them the recorded deed proving I am the sole legal owner of this house, and I will have you removed for trespassing tonight. You can take whatever you can carry in your bare hands and figure out where to sleep on the street. The threat was explicit and violent. He was entirely willing to render his own daughter homeless in the middle of the night simply because she hesitated to act as his personal servant. He truly believed he held the power of life and death over my immediate future. I slowly reached out and picked up the cheap black cotton apron from the bed. My hands shook slightly, a deliberate physical manifestation of my supposed surrender. I looked at the rough fabric and then back at my father. Okay, I whispered, my voice entirely devoid of hope. I will do it. I will come downstairs and help the catering staff. Just please do not throw me out tonight. I have nowhere else to go. My father smiled, a tight, victorious expression that conveyed absolute patriarchal triumph. Good, he said, smoothing the lapels of his expensive tuxedo. It is nice to see you finally showing some respect for authority. Wash your face and get downstairs in 5 minutes. Do not embarrass me, Whitney. He turned and walked out of the bedroom, leaving the door wide open behind him, so the loud, booming sounds of the party flooded back into the space. I listened to his heavy, confident footsteps descending the grand staircase, returning to his adoring, sycophantic crowd. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, the cheap black apron dangling from my fingertips. The performance was officially over. The final piece of evidence regarding his malicious intent had been logged and filed. He had explicitly threatened to illegally evict me without proper judicial process, adding yet another layer of civil liability to his already towering mountain of federal crimes. I walked over to the door and closed it, locking the heavy brass bolt with a satisfying resonant click. I walked back to the bed and dropped the catering apron directly into the small trash can beside my nightstand. I would not be wearing cheap cotton tonight. I would not be serving Wagyu beef sliders to men who were actively conspiring to steal my generational wealth. I would not be addressing anyone as sir or looking at the floor in submission. I turned back to the closet and pulled open the louvered doors. The midnight blue bespoke power suit hung there, pristine and lethal, waiting for its moment. I ran my hand along the sharp, immaculate lapel, feeling the heavy, expensive weight of the fabric. My father wanted me to come downstairs and earn my keep. He wanted me to show his elite peers exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy. I was going to give him exactly what he asked for. I was going to walk down those stairs and introduce myself to every single one of his wealthy investors. But I was not going to be holding a silver tray of champagne flutes. I was going to be holding the very sharp, very heavy blade of the federal justice system. The time for hiding in the shadows and gathering evidence was officially complete. It was time to initiate the public execution. The transformation took exactly 22 minutes. I stripped away the faded, oversized college sweatshirt and the baggy sweatpants that had served as my camouflage for the past 2 weeks. I stepped into the midnight blue bespoke suit. The fabric draped over my frame with lethal precision. The shoulders were sharp and commanding. The tailored trousers broke perfectly over a pair of black stiletto heels. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse, buttoned high, and a minimalist silver watch that cost more than Brandon's entire fraudulent mining farm. I pulled my hair back into a severe, sleek chignon, smoothing away every single stray strand. I applied my makeup with the cold, calculated focus of a soldier preparing for battle. Sharp, contoured cheekbones and a deep crimson lip that projected absolute, unyielding authority. I did not look like a struggling administrative assistant. I did not look like a pathetic squatter facing imminent eviction. I looked exactly like what I was: a senior partner at a top-tier litigation firm who was about to systematically destroy every single person in the room. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase. Inside sat the certified original trust documents, the forensic tax fraud dossiers, and the high-definition transcripts of their recorded confessions. I unlocked my bedroom door and stepped out onto the second-floor landing. The wall of sound hitting me from the main floor was almost a physical force. The live jazz quartet was playing a smooth, upbeat tempo. Crystal champagne flutes clinked constantly. The deep, booming laughter of wealthy, arrogant men echoed off the intricate crown molding. I stood in the shadows of the upstairs hallway looking down at the magnificent foyer of my grandmother's house. It was packed shoulder to shoulder with Austin's financial elite. I recognized several faces immediately. There was the president of the largest regional commercial bank holding a plate of imported caviar. There were three prominent private equity managers standing by the fireplace, evaluating the original stonework. Near the front door, I spotted Brandon's shady crypto investors. They looked entirely out of place in their dark leather jackets, glaring menacingly at Brandon, while he desperately tried to placate them with empty promises and sweeping gestures toward the expensive crowd. Right in the center of the grand foyer, holding court under the massive crystal chandelier, stood my father. He was holding a glass of premium scotch, laughing loudly at a joke made by a venture capitalist. He was completely in his element, absorbing the admiration of his peers, thriving on the absolute certainty that he had won. He was a man who believed he had successfully stolen a multi-million-dollar asset and erased his own daughter without breaking a sweat. I stepped up to the edge of the grand staircase. The first step I took was deliberate. The sharp, heavy click of my stiletto heel against the polished hardwood echoed out. I took another step. Click, then another. Click. I did not rush. I descended the sweeping curved staircase with the slow, hypnotic grace of a predator entering the feeding ground. The woman standing nearest to the staircase, a wealthy socialite draped in diamonds, was the first to notice me. She stopped mid-sentence, her champagne glass hovering near her mouth, her eyes widening as she took in the stark, commanding presence moving down the stairs. She nudged her husband. He turned and his conversation immediately died. The silence began to spread like a drop of ink in a glass of water. It rippled outward from the staircase, catching the attention of the private equity managers, the bank presidents, and the local politicians. One by one, the elite guests stopped talking and turned to look. Even the jazz quartet, sensing the sudden dramatic shift in the atmosphere, faltered their smooth melody, trailing off into a hesitant, disjointed stop. Within 30 seconds, my living room went completely dead silent. Over 50 of the most powerful people in the city were staring directly at me, completely captivated and entirely confused. They were expecting a desperate, disheveled tenant to be dragged out by security. They were not expecting a woman radiating absolute corporate dominance to descend from the private quarters. The profound silence finally caught my father's attention. He turned away from his conversation, a polite, practiced smile still plastered on his face. The moment his eyes locked onto mine, the smile completely vanished. The color drained from his flushed cheeks, leaving him a sickly pale gray. His jaw slackened. He blinked rapidly, trying to process the visual contradictions standing before him. He was looking for the cheap black catering apron. He was looking for the slumped shoulders and the trembling voice. Instead, he was staring at a titanium wall. The shock quickly mutated into a dark, violent rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He slammed his scotch glass down onto a passing waiter's silver tray and marched directly toward the bottom of the staircase. He did not care that 50 wealthy investors were watching him. His patriarchal authority had been directly challenged, and his primary instinct was immediate brute force suppression. He stopped at the bottom step, blocking my path. He leaned in, closing the distance between us, his face just inches from mine. His breath smelled heavily of expensive liquor and pure panic. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" he hissed, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper, meant only for my ears. "I told you to put the apron on and serve the food. Go back upstairs, take this ridiculous costume off, and get into the kitchen right now." I stood on the second step, maintaining my height advantage, looking directly down into his furious, panicked eyes. I did not flinch. I did not take a step back. I simply smiled, a cold, empty smile that made his aggressive posture falter for a fraction of a second. "You are intentionally trying to embarrass me in front of my buyers," he continued, whispering furiously, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I warned you, Whitney. If you do not turn around and march back up those stairs right now, I will have the police drag you out of this house in handcuffs. I am the legal owner of this property, and you are actively trespassing on my goodwill. Do not push me." Before I could deliver my response, Linda noticed the tense confrontation from across the room. She had been busy schmoozing with a real estate broker near the back patio, but the sudden absolute silence of the party had drawn her attention. Seeing my father visibly struggling to control me on the staircase sent her into an immediate frantic damage control mode. She recognized that the wealthy buyers were watching an uncomfortable domestic dispute unfold in the middle of a high-stakes property showcase. She needed to neutralize the threat and restore the pristine aesthetic immediately. She rushed across the foyer, her designer heels clicking rapidly against the floor. She plastered a wide artificial smile across her face, letting out a loud, highly exaggerated laugh that sounded entirely unhinged in the quiet room. She waved her hands dismissively at the crowd, attempting to commandeer the narrative and twist my presence into a pathetic joke. "I am so sorry, everyone," Linda announced, her voice shrill and projecting loudly to ensure every single guest in the room could hear her. "Please excuse the interruption. This is my husband's estranged daughter, Whitney. She is having a bit of a difficult time adjusting to reality." She stepped up next to my father, trying to loop her arm through his, but he was too rigid with anger to accept the gesture. Linda turned her fake sympathetic smile directly toward the private equity managers standing nearby. "We were forced to serve her with a formal eviction notice this week," Linda explained loudly, adopting the tone of a weary, long-suffering martyr. "She has been squatting in this property for years, contributing absolutely nothing. I am afraid the stress of finally having to move out and get a real job has caused a minor psychological breakdown. She actually thinks playing dress-up in a business suit will somehow stop the legal sale of the house. It is honestly just tragic. Please do not mind her delusions. She will be returning to her bedroom now so we can continue the evening." She turned back to me, her fake smile dropping instantly, replaced by a look of sheer venomous hatred. "Go upstairs, you pathetic little girl," she commanded, her voice dropping to a harsh guttural whisper. "You are ruining a multi-million-dollar deal. Get out of my sight before I personally throw you out the front door." I looked at Linda, observing the frantic, desperate pulsing of the vein in her forehead. I looked at my father, watching the absolute terror, masked by blind rage, swirling in his eyes. I looked out over the sea of wealthy, powerful guests who were hanging on every single word, waiting to see how the delusional squatter would react to being publicly humiliated by the rightful owners of the estate. I tightened my grip on the handle of my leather briefcase. I had played their game perfectly. I had let them build their magnificent stage. I had let them gather their most important audience. I had let them explicitly state their intentions and their supposed legal authority out loud in front of 50 unimpeachable witnesses. The bait had been entirely consumed. The trap was locked shut. It was time to pull the lever. I reached out gracefully to a passing waiter's silver tray and picked up a crystal champagne flute. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the expensive vintage my father had purchased with stolen money. The room was so deadly quiet that the soft sound of me swallowing echoed across the grand foyer. I lowered the glass and set it down onto the polished marble surface of a nearby antique console table. The sharp, resonant clink rang out like a judge striking a heavy wooden gavel. I turned my attention away from Linda and looked directly at the cluster of wealthy private equity managers standing by the fireplace. I let a genuine, brilliant smile illuminate my face. I am not being evicted. Linda, I said, my voice projecting with absolute crystal clear authority, cutting through the heavy, suffocating tension in the room. But every single one of you is currently trespassing on my private property. A collective sharp gasp rippled through the crowd of elite investors. The socialites clutched their pearls, and the bank presidents exchanged deeply uncomfortable, panicked glances. My father lunged forward, his face contorted in absolute unhinged fury, his hands reaching out as if to grab my shoulders and physically throw me out the front door himself. "Get out of my house!" he roared, the thick veins in his neck bulging dangerously against his starched white collar. "I am calling the police right now. You are having a complete psychotic break." Linda chimed in, immediately pointing a shaking, manicured finger at my face. "Security!" she shrieked, her voice breaking with frantic desperation. "Somebody call security and get this crazy woman out of here. She is entirely delusional." I did not step back. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my raging father. I simply raised my right hand high into the air and snapped my fingers once. It was a sharp, commanding sound that sliced cleanly through their hysterical screaming. The massive, heavy oak front doors of the Victorian house swung open instantly. The cool evening breeze swept into the stifling, crowded foyer, carrying with it the undeniable heavy weight of federal justice. 3 towering men wearing immaculate, dark-tailored suits marched into the house. They did not look like party guests, and they certainly did not look like hired catering staff. They moved with the synchronized, lethal precision of highly trained tactical operators entering a hostile combat zone. Leading the pack was Harrison, my lead forensic investigator, carrying 2 massive heavy leather legal briefcases. Flanking him were 2 off-duty law enforcement officers I had retained through my firm for private security details. They stepped inside the grand foyer and immediately locked the heavy front doors behind them, sliding the brass deadbolts shut with a resounding final click that echoed ominously through the silent room. The crowd began to panic. A low murmur of genuine alarm swept through the wealthy investors as they realized they were suddenly locked inside a house with men who looked ready to execute a federal raid. My father stopped dead in his tracks, his aggressive forward momentum completely halted by the towering, physically imposing presence of my security team. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his booming voice suddenly cracking with a distinct underlying tremor of fear. "Get out of my house before I have you all arrested for breaking and entering." Harrison ignored him completely. He did not even spare my father a single glance. He marched straight past the sputtering patriarch, stepping up to my right side and setting the heavy legal briefcases down onto a sturdy oak table with a loud, authoritative thud. He stood at attention, perfectly silent, radiating absolute menace and professional competence. I stepped forward, closing the remaining distance between myself and the audience of terrified, arrogant elites. I smoothed the sharp lapels of my midnight blue bespoke suit, feeling the heavy, expensive fabric settle perfectly against my frame. I locked eyes with the most prominent regional bank president in the room, a man I knew my father had been desperately trying to court for years to secure a massive commercial loan. "For those of you I have not had the pleasure of meeting, formally allow me to reintroduce myself," I announced, my voice echoing with the polished, lethal cadence of a master litigator delivering a closing statement to a captive jury. "My name is Whitney. I am not a struggling administrative assistant. I am not a pathetic squatter clinging to my father's generosity. I am a senior partner specializing in real estate fraud litigation at Crawford & Cole." The impact of the firm name dropped like a physical bomb into the very center of the grand foyer. Crawford & Cole was not just a law firm, it was an absolute institution. It was the most ruthless, feared corporate litigation powerhouse in the entire state of Texas. Every single wealthy investor, venture capitalist, and bank executive standing in my living room instantly recognized the name. They knew the reputation of the apex predators who occupied that specific glass skyscraper downtown. I watched the blood drain entirely from the faces of my father's elite peers. The bank president took a sudden, terrified step backward, physically bumping into a waiter holding a tray of caviar. A wealthy real estate developer near the back of the crowd actually dropped his champagne glass, letting it shatter spectacularly against the hardwood floor. They knew exactly what Crawford and Cole represented. They knew that a senior partner at that firm commanded an army of legal assassins and wielded enough raw judicial power to bankrupt entire multinational corporations before lunch. They suddenly realized they were not attending an exclusive private real estate sale. They were standing directly inside the blast radius of a massive high-stakes legal execution. They had been lured into a crime scene, and they were currently drinking champagne funded by a man who was actively committing a federal felony. The wealthy socialites began whispering frantically to their husbands, urging them to leave immediately. The venture capitalists suddenly looked at my father with deep, unmasked suspicion, assessing him not as a peer, but as a toxic liability who had just dragged them into a career-ending scandal. My father stood frozen in the center of the room, his mouth hanging slightly open, his eyes darting frantically between my $3,000 tailored suit, my elite security team, and the terrified, disgusted faces of his most important investors. He tried to speak to command the room the way he always did, but only a strangled, wet wheeze escaped his throat. The cognitive dissonance was simply too massive for his arrogant brain to process. The worthless, obedient daughter he had relentlessly mocked and tormented for over a decade was suddenly standing before him as one of the most powerful legal figures in the state. Linda was gripping the wooden banister of the grand staircase so tightly, her knuckles had turned completely white. She looked as though she might physically faint. Her arrogant, condescending facade had completely evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated horror. She looked at me, and for the first time in her miserable, shallow life, she actually saw me. She saw the lethal predator she had foolishly invited into her crosshairs. She saw the woman she had tried to evict, now holding the absolute power to destroy her entire comfortable existence. I turned my gaze to Brandon, who was shrinking back against the wall near the formal dining room, trying desperately to hide behind his dangerous crypto investors. The investors themselves had stopped glaring at Brandon and were now staring at me, a look of dawning, terrifying comprehension spreading across their aggressive features. They realized the seed money Brandon had promised them was a complete illusion. They realized the wealthy father who was supposed to bail out their golden boy was currently being dismantled in his own foyer. I turned back to my father, letting the crushing silence of the room stretch on for a few more agonizing seconds. The power dynamic had entirely inverted. He was no longer the imposing patriarch. He was a cornered, desperate animal staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. Harrison snapped the brass latches of the first leather briefcase. The sharp metallic sound echoed like a gunshot. He opened the lid, revealing thick, perfectly organized stacks of legal documents, forensic accounting reports, and federal court filings. The trap was fully sprung. The audience was captive. The executioner's briefcases were open and waiting. I reached into the briefcase and pulled out the first massive legal binder, preparing to deliver the killing blow. Every single eye in the room tracked my hand as I lifted the heavy binder. The thick stack of paper represented the culmination of weeks of silent suffering, meticulous planning, and ruthless execution. My father had spent his entire life building a fragile empire on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and the systematic financial abuse of his own daughter. He had invited these people here to validate his supremacy, to watch him cast me out into the street. Instead, they were about to serve as the ultimate captive audience to his complete, absolute ruin. The air in the room felt electric, charged with the sudden, undeniable realization that I controlled every single exit, every single document, and every single future outcome for the three people who had tried to destroy me. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet, intoxicating taste of pure vengeance settle into my chest. The real estate magnate, the cruel stepmother, and the golden child were completely trapped, and I was holding the keys to their cells. I stepped off the final stair and walked directly up to my father. He stood paralyzed as I slammed the massive 4-inch thick legal binder directly against his chest. Instinct forced him to grab it. The sheer physical weight of the evidence made him stagger backward a fraction of an inch. I turned my back to him, immediately addressing the silent, captivated room. "What my father Thomas just attempted to sell you tonight is a stunning piece of historic architecture," I announced, my voice echoing clearly through the grand foyer. "It is also completely and legally untouchable." I walked toward the private equity managers who had been admiring the stonework earlier. 15 years ago, my grandmother, Beatrice Harrington, foresaw this exact scenario. She knew her son was driven by a toxic, insatiable greed. She approached me when I was just beginning my legal career, and together we drafted an absolute masterpiece of asset protection. We transferred the deed of this historic Victorian home directly into a blind corporate trust. It is not owned by a person, but by a corporate entity of which I am the sole executor and primary beneficiary. The bank presidents in the room instantly stiffened. They understood the gravity of corporate asset law. When Thomas filed a quitclaim deed last week to evict me and claim this property, he did not just commit standard state-level forgery. I explained, pacing slowly to ensure every guest heard every word. He attempted a hostile takeover of a registered corporate entity, crossing directly into federal jurisdiction. Any transaction regarding this property that does not bear my specific authorized signature is a federal crime. My father dropped the heavy binder onto a silver catering table with a loud crash. "This is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperate panic. "She is making this up to humiliate me. I have the county records. She is completely insane." I did not even look at him. I simply gestured to Harrison, who stood stoically by the door. Harrison unclasped the second leather briefcase. He began pulling out pristine, certified copies of the trust documents and passing them directly to the most prominent investors in the room. I watched their eyes scan the heavy legal jargon. I watched the horrible realization dawn on their faces as they recognized the official state seals and the bulletproof legal phrasing. "Look closely at the signature on my father's supposed deed," I instructed the crowd. "Then look at the date of the notary stamp. You will find that the county clerk offices were conveniently closed on that specific Sunday. You will also find that the notary involved lost his license 3 years ago for processing fraudulent documents." Linda pushed her way forward, her face completely devoid of its previous arrogant flush. The heavy makeup she wore now looked like a cracking mask. "You cannot do this, Whitney!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly, bouncing off the crystal chandelier. "We have buyers lined up. We have deposits ready to transfer. You are ruining our entire future." "And that brings us to the actual motive behind this pathetic, desperate crime," I said, raising my voice to command the space. I pointed directly at Brandon, who was visibly shaking near the dining room archway, trying to hide behind a tall floral arrangement. "My half-brother Brandon has been marketing himself to many of you as a brilliant tech visionary. He recently convinced several private investors to front $500,000 for a cryptocurrency mining farm." The men in the dark leather jackets standing near Brandon suddenly straightened up. Their glares turned absolutely murderous as they locked their eyes onto the golden child. "Brandon blew through that entire $500,000 in less than 3 months on leased cars and private parties," I announced, projecting every word clearly across the room. "He is entirely bankrupt, but that is just the tip of the iceberg." Harrison handed out the financial forensic dossiers. Harrison moved methodically through the crowd, distributing sleek black folders to the bank executives and the venture capitalists. The wealthy men opened the folders, their expressions morphing from shock to absolute revulsion. "For the past 5 years, my father has been using Brandon's spectacular string of failed companies as a highly illegal tax shield," I explained, keeping my posture rigid and dominant. Whenever Brandon bankrupted a company, my father funneled his own untaxed corporate profits into the dying business, writing them off as massive commercial losses to evade federal taxes. He used his own son's incompetence to steal from the government, The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the rustling of thick, expensive paper as the city's financial elite read the undeniable proof of Thomas's white-collar crimes. They were reading the exact wire transfer amounts and the falsified depreciation schedules. My father got greedy. I continued stopping right in front of the regional bank president. He attempted to funnel over $1 million through Brandon's crypto scheme. That specific massive transaction triggered an automated federal audit. The Internal Revenue Service opened an active criminal investigation into my father's primary holding company 3 months ago. They are currently preparing a multi-million-dollar tax lien that will freeze every single asset he possesses, including the country club memberships and the luxury cars. I turned back to my father. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff feeling the ground crumble beneath his expensive Italian shoes. Sweat was beading on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. "That is why you threw this ridiculous, desperate party, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal, quiet tone that carried perfectly across the entire room. "You were not selling this house to build a family legacy. You were frantically trying to liquidate a stolen multi-million-dollar asset to generate clean, untraceable cash. You needed to pay off the IRS before they send federal agents to raid your office. You were going to use the earnest money from these investors to cover up your own massive felony and leave them holding a worthless forged deed." My father finally found his voice, though it was weak and trembling. "It is circumstantial garbage," he spat out, pointing a shaking finger at me. "She hacked into my accounts. She fabricated this entire narrative to ruin my reputation. It is hearsay, and none of it will hold up in a court of law. I am a respected businessman." I smiled. It was the moment of absolute checkmate. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a small, sleek wireless remote. I aimed it directly at the high-end Bluetooth sound system Linda had aggressively installed for the jazz quartet earlier that afternoon. I anticipated you might say that I replied smoothly, so I decided to let you explain it to your investors yourself. I pressed the button. The smooth jazz music immediately cut out. A second of static hissed through the expensive surround sound speakers, followed by the crystal-clear, high-definition audio recording from the previous night. My father's booming, arrogant voice filled his own party, completely unfiltered and undeniably authentic. "I paid Dennis $50,000 in cash to secure that fake stamp," the recorded voice declared. A collective gasp from the crowd rippled through the room. Men in expensive suits physically recoiled. The recording continued, broadcasting his explicit confession to the entire foyer. $50,000 to backdate a single piece of paper and keep his mouth permanently shut. Dennis is a degenerate gambler who lost his official notary license 3 years ago. I let the audio play through Linda's malicious confirmation of the forgery. I let them hear her laugh about evicting me. I let them hear Brandon's panicked whining about his violent California investors and his desperate need for the funds to save his own skin. Every single word of their conspiracy echoed off the high ceilings, condemning them with their own arrogant voices. When the clip ended, I clicked the remote, shutting off the system entirely. The absolute dead silence that followed was heavy enough to crush solid bone. The managing director of the largest private equity firm in Austin was the first to move. He aggressively threw the black forensic folder onto a silver catering tray, sending shrimp canapes tumbling to the floor. He turned to his wife, grabbing her arm. "We are leaving immediately," he barked, his voice tight with sheer, unadulterated panic. The illusion was completely shattered. These were wealthy, powerful people who survived by avoiding legal liability at all costs. Standing inside a house where a federal crime was actively being committed was professional suicide. The sudden, horrifying realization that my father had tried to implicate them in wire fraud by selling them a stolen asset sparked an instant, desperate stampede. The elegant cocktail party devolved into absolute frantic chaos. Women in designer dresses rushed to grab their expensive coats, abandoning their crystal glasses on stair steps and windowsills. Bank presidents shoved past confused waiters to reach the exit, treating my father like he was highly infectious. Brandon's crypto investors did not leave immediately. They marched directly up to Brandon, grabbing him by the collar of his designer shirt and shoving him hard against the formal dining room wall. "You have until Monday morning," the lead investor snarled, his voice dripping with violent promise, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Or we take it out of your hide." They dropped him onto the hardwood floor and stormed out, joining the mass exodus. I nodded to Harrison, who smoothly slid the heavy brass deadbolts back and pulled the massive front doors wide open. The elite guests flooded out into the warm Texas night, desperate to escape the blast radius of my father's collapsing empire. I stood near the staircase watching them flee. Valets outside began shouting, trying to coordinate the frantic sudden demand for vehicles. Tires squealed aggressively against the pavement as luxury sports cars and black SUVs sped away from the property as fast as mechanically possible. Within 5 minutes, the crowded, bustling high society gala was completely entirely empty. Even the hired caterers, recognizing the severe legal danger, had quietly slipped out through the back patio, abandoning their expensive silver trays and half-empty champagne bottles. The massive historic house fell incredibly silent, leaving only the ruins of a destroyed dynasty in its wake. The heavy oak doors remained firmly shut. Inside the grand foyer, the silence was absolute and suffocating. The air still smelled faintly of expensive catering and imported flowers, but the atmosphere had transformed into a sterile holding cell. Harrison stood impassively by the exit, blocking the only viable path to freedom. My 2 private security officers flanked him, their presence a physical reminder that the era of my father's absolute authority was permanently over. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by discarded crystal champagne flutes and scattered forensic dossiers. I looked at the 3 people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They were completely cornered, stripped of their wealthy audience, and robbed of their arrogant delusions. My father Thomas collapsed heavily into a velvet accent chair. The crisp lines of his tailored tuxedo suddenly looked ridiculous on his slumped, defeated frame. He stared blankly at the floor, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the catastrophic legal nightmare he had just brought upon himself. He knew he was no longer a respected titan of real estate. He was a federal suspect, and he had practically gift-wrapped the evidence for the prosecution. Linda was the first to break. The realization that her luxury lifestyle had just evaporated sent her into a state of absolute frantic hysterics. She fell to her knees on the vintage Persian rug, the very same rug she had commanded contractors to replace just days ago. Thick black mascara ran down her cheeks, completely ruining her flawless cosmetic mask. "Whitney, please." Linda sobbed, her voice cracking with raw, pathetic desperation. "You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are still family. Your father was just stressed. He made a terrible mistake, but he loves you. I love you. We can fix this. We can hire contractors to fix the scratch on the table. We can cancel the real estate listings right now. Just tell your men to let us go." I looked down at her fake, desperate tears. The sheer audacity of her attempting to weaponize the concept of family after she had spent 2 weeks treating me like a disposable pest was genuinely repulsive. "Get up, Linda," I commanded, my voice entirely devoid of warmth. "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you care about family. 2 days ago, you told a real estate broker I was a pathetic squatter. Yesterday, you told me to sleep under a highway overpass. You only care about family when the alternative is losing your country club membership and trading your designer wardrobe for a prison uniform." Brandon was trembling uncontrollably near the dining room archway. The aggressive tech bro persona had completely dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, deeply indebted man-child. "Whitney," he stammered, taking a hesitant step forward. "Those California investors are going to kill me. They are going to find my apartment and break my legs. You have to help me. You have millions in your accounts. You can pay them off. You are my sister." I turned my gaze to him, freezing him in his tracks. "You burned through $500,000 on private jets and leased sports cars, Brandon. You chose to defraud dangerous people. You chose to let our father steal my home to cover your catastrophic failures. Your debt is your problem. You are going to have to learn how to survive in the real world without a safety net, just like you and Dad forced me to do at 18. I signaled to Harrison. He stepped forward, opening the final compartment of his leather briefcase. He extracted a thick stack of legal documents securely bound in a rigid blue cover. He placed the stack onto the antique table, pushing a heavy brass pen precisely to the center of the paperwork. I looked directly at my father, who slowly lifted his gaze to meet mine. "This is a comprehensive civil settlement agreement," I explained, my tone shifting back into a cold professional cadence. "By signing this document, Thomas, you are unconditionally surrendering any and all future claims to this property, to my personal assets, and to the Beatrice Harrington Irrevocable Corporate Trust. You will legally admit to committing forgery regarding the quitclaim deed. You will explicitly waive your right to contest this agreement in any civil court." My father stared at the document, his hands shaking. "And if I sign this," he rasped, his voice sounding 10 years older, "you drop the criminal charges, you make this go away." I smiled, a sharp, predatory smile that held absolutely zero mercy. "No," I replied simply. The remaining color drained from his face. "What do you mean, no? You just said this is a settlement." "It is a civil settlement, Dad," I clarified. "It protects you from me completely bankrupting you in a civil court for extreme emotional distress, property damage, and gross negligence. It prevents me from taking whatever meager assets you might have left. But it does not protect you from the federal government." I stepped closer to him, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "I want you to understand exactly how thoroughly you have been defeated. I did not just build a civil case against you tonight. I already forwarded the unredacted digital copies of your offshore bank transfers, your fake depreciation schedules, and your recorded bribery confession directly to the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The emails were sent automatically at 7 o'clock tonight, right as you were greeting your first-party guests. The federal authorities already have everything." My father let out a choked, agonizing sound. He buried his face in his hands, physically devastated by the realization that his destruction was absolute and irreversible. He had lost everything: his wealth, his reputation, his freedom, and the daughter he had consistently underestimated. "You have two choices tonight," I continued, gesturing to the brass pen. "You can sign this confession and surrender your civil claims, avoiding a lengthy public trial where I slowly dissect your entire life in front of a jury. Or you can refuse to sign it, and I will personally ensure that my litigation firm drains every single penny you possess before the federal prosecutors even bring you to trial. Either way, you have lost. Sign the paper." He did not argue. He did not attempt to negotiate or utilize his usual intimidating tactics. The patriarch was dead. He picked up the brass pen with trembling fingers and signed his name on the dotted lines, legally binding his own defeat. He passed the pen to Linda, who sobbed hysterically as she signed away her rights. Brandon was the last to sign, his hand shaking so violently he could barely form the letters. Harrison smoothly collected the documents, sliding them back into the secure briefcase. The legal guillotine had fallen. "Now," I said, stepping back and addressing all three of them, "you have exactly 30 minutes to vacate my property. Since you were so eager to evict me and stage this house for sale, I assume you do not have much to pack. Harrison, please provide the guests with suitable luggage." Harrison reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a tightly rolled package of heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. He tossed them onto the floor right at Brandon's feet. "You want us to pack our things in garbage bags?" Linda shrieked, fresh horror washing over her face. "We have expensive designer clothing. We cannot carry our belongings out in trash bags." "You are going to pack whatever you can fit into those bags in 30 minutes, I corrected her, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a judge delivering a sentence. "Any items left behind after 30 minutes will be considered legally abandoned property, and I will have my contractors throw them into a dumpster tomorrow morning. Your 30-day notice was just instantly revoked due to your involvement in a federal felony on the premises. Your time starts right now." They did not waste a single second, the sheer terror of the situation finally overriding their vanity. Linda scrambled up the stairs, her expensive heels discarded in her frantic rush to salvage her jewelry and designer shoes. Brandon sprinted toward the guest room, frantically stuffing his tangled computer cables and expensive gaming monitors into the black plastic bags, sobbing openly as he realized he had nowhere safe to go. My father simply stood up and walked toward the coat closet, pulling out his overcoat and staring blankly at the wall, a hollow, shattered shell of a man. Exactly 30 minutes later, they stood in the grand foyer clutching heavy, bulging black trash bags. They looked entirely absurd. The wealthy, arrogant invaders reduced to carrying their worldly possessions in disposable plastic. My private security officers escorted them out the front doors, marching them down the long driveway, and explicitly ordering them never to return. I watched from the threshold as they loaded their garbage bags into their luxury SUV. The taillights flickered in the darkness as they drove away into the night, banished permanently from the kingdom they had tried to steal. I closed the heavy oak doors and slid the brass deadbolts shut, locking them securely into place. I stood alone in the grand foyer, taking a deep, steadying breath. The house was finally quiet. The toxic, suffocating shadow of my family had been permanently eradicated. I had reclaimed my territory, my dignity, and my grandmother's legacy. The silent ascent was over, and the view from the top was absolutely spectacular. 6 weeks later, a gentle morning breeze swept across the wraparound porch of my historic Victorian home. I sat in a comfortable wicker chair wearing a soft, oversized sweater and holding a warm mug of freshly brewed coffee. The antique mahogany dining table inside had been perfectly restored by a professional woodworker, erasing the last physical reminder of Brandon's violent disrespect. I opened my tablet, scrolling through the morning news updates. A prominent headline dominated the local financial section. Prominent Austin real estate developer Thomas indicted on massive federal tax fraud charges. The article detailed the multi-million-dollar liens, the frozen corporate assets, and the severe prison sentences he and his associates were currently facing. The investigation had rapidly expanded, sweeping up his corrupt notary and permanently shuttering Brandon's fraudulent LLCs. I took a slow, peaceful sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark flavor settle on my tongue. I looked out over the manicured front lawn, watching the sunlight filter through the leaves of the old oak tree. The air smelled sweet and clear. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. I had built a beautiful, quiet life entirely on my own terms. I had faced the monsters of my past, and I had methodically, legally, and ruthlessly dismantled their entire world. I was finally absolutely at peace.